Chapter 22. Sebastian was careful to wait until after 12 o'clock to pay a call on the Park Street home of his aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Claiborne. The house was not, technically, the property of the Dowager, but belonged to her son, the present Duke of Claiborne. But the Duke, a stout, mild-mannered man well into his middle years, knew himself to be no match for his formidable mother. Rather than assert his rights of ownership, he simply lived with his growing family in a much smaller house in Half Moon Street, leaving Henrietta in possession of the grand pile over which she had reigned as mistress for more than half a century. Born Lady Henrietta St. Cyr, the eldest sister of the current Earl of Hendon, she was one of the few people who knew that she was not actually Sebastian's aunt, although the world believed her to be. But neither Sebastian nor Henrietta was the type to allow technicalities to interfere in their affections. He found her seated at her breakfast table, a half-eaten piece of toast and a cup of tea before her. Like her brother, she was big-boned and fleshy, with a broad, plain face, and the piercing blue eyes that were the hallmark of the St. Cyr family. She had never been a pretty woman, even when young, but she was every inch the Earl's daughter, and made a splendid duchess. Always exquisitely groomed and imperious in manner, she was one of the grandes dames of society, and if at all possible she never left her dressing-room before 1 o'clock. "Good heavens, aunt," said Sebastian, bending to kiss her rouged cheek. "The clocks have barely struck 12, and I find you already on the verge of setting forth into the world. How dreadfully unfashionable." She rapped him affectionately on the ear, chuckling as she straightened the towering purple turban he'd knocked slightly askew. "Impertinent jackanapes. As it happens, I did not sleep well last night. All that banging and booming, I swear it was enough to wake the dead. Now stop looming over me and sit down and tell me why you are here. No, don't bring him a cup of tea, you foolish man," she told the hapless footman, who was about to do just that. "Get him some ale." Sebastian drew out the seat beside her. "What makes you so certain I'm not here simply for the pleasure of your company? Because I know you, and because I read the papers." She paused, a hint of apprehension tightening the lines around her mouth. Henrietta might be leery of his recent marriage to the daughter of Lord Jarvis, but she had never approved of his relationship with Cat either. Sebastian knew she would frown on anything likely to bring him once more into the orbit of his ex-mistress. She leaned forward, her gaze hard on his face. "But first, I want you to tell me how your new bride gets on. Is she well? Hero? I doubt she's ever been sick in her life. I wanted to ask—" "I saw her in Bond Street the other day," said Henrietta, ignoring his attempt to change the subject. "She looked ravishing. Positively glowing, in fact, which is not a word I ever thought I would use to describe Hero Jarvis. She's not by chance increasing, is she?" She looked at him archly. Sebastian stared back at her. Her capacity to ferret out other people's secrets had always struck him as bordering on the uncanny. He said, "Bit soon for that, isn't it?" "Is it?" Sebastian paused while her man placed a tankard of ale before him, then drank deeply. "I'm here to ask what you can tell me about the Hopes." A faint, enigmatic smile touched her lips. She took a delicate sip of her tea, then said, "Which ones?" "Henry Philip and Thomas." "Ah! Well, there isn't much to say about Henry Philip. He's never married, you know, and seldom ventures out into company. Queer little man. I understand he's something of a gem collector." "He is, yes. I've heard it said he has the largest private collection of jewels in Europe, although I've never seen it personally." "What about Thomas? Does he share his brother's interest in gems?" "Not to my knowledge. Oh, he buys the odd piece for that wife of his." Henrietta's nose quivered in a way that told him Louisa Hope was not one of her favourites. "But for the most part he fancies himself something of an antiquary and patron of the arts." Tell me about his wife. Louisa de la Poor Beresford. Her uncle is the Earl of Tyrone and the Marquis of Waterford. And her father? Some clergyman. In Ireland, of all places. So Thomas Hope was quite a catch for her. He was, yes. Although I've heard there were tears when the match was first suggested to her. He is rather unattractive, even if he is staggeringly rich. True, but I believe there was more to it than that. She had formed a previous attachment to someone who was most unsuitable, a byblow of her uncle or some such thing. There was no question of the family ever allowing anything to come of that. So in the end she gave up and married Hope. Admirable, said Sebastian with heavy sarcasm. His aunt frowned at him. Realistic. A pity she doesn't appear to have much of a fondness for Egyptian sarcophagi, or for Thomas Hope for that matter. Indeed, I fear she's turned into one of those females who seems to believe that just because they are unhappy, they must needs devote their lives to an attempt to make the rest of the world miserable as well. Sebastian smiled. Not fond of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, are you, Aunt? I always say there is nothing wrong with a bit of vice as long as it's not taken to the extreme. Give me someone with a touch of vice over someone with an excess of sanctimonious hypocrisy any day. He laughed and took another swallow of ale. I understand she has a young cousin staying with her from Ireland. Have you met him? Henrietta's scowl cleared. I have, yes. Blair Beresford, charming young man. As attractive as his cousin, but with none of Louisa's self-righteous drivel. I must say, however, that I do not care for that military man he is taken up with. You mean Lieutenant Tyson? I do, yes. He may be a fine figure of a man, and I know the Tysons are an old, respected Hereford family, but there's something not quite right about him. And don't ask me to explain it, because I can't. She drained her teacup, set it aside, then fixed him with a level stare. Now, not another word will you get out of me until you tell me how the Hopes could possibly be involved in Isla's murder. And there is no point in trying to deny that's what this is all about, because I know you. I don't know that they are involved. Well, I certainly trust you don't intend to start suspecting everyone who ever bought jewels from that dreadful man. Good heavens, said Sebastian, opening his eyes a little wider. Aunt Henrietta, what did you buy from him? She put up a hand to straighten her turban again, although it was not in need of adjustment. That lovely little diamond bracelet I wore to the Queen's drawing-room recently. The one Claiborne made such a fuss over when he saw it. Mind you, I didn't deal with Isla directly, but I had no doubt where the piece came from. So, with whom did you deal? A lapidary named John Francillon. He has an establishment on the Strand. I actually saw him there a few days ago. You mean you saw Francillon? No, I mean that I saw Isla in Francillon's shop. What day was this? Saturday, I believe. The two were huddled together in the back when I first walked in. I wouldn't have paid much attention if Isla hadn't been acting positively furtive about the entire affair. Sebastian smiled. So naturally, then, you did pay attention. I did? Yes. Although I managed to get only a glimpse of the stone involved, what looked like an enormous blue sapphire. After Isla left, I asked Francillon if the item was for sale. He became quite flustered when he realized I'd seen it and begged me not to tell anyone about it. Which I would not have done, she added, if Isla weren't dead. Sebastian stood and planted a loud kiss on her cheek. Aunt Henrietta, I don't know what I'd do without you. Where are you going? She asked as he headed for the door. To pay a call on your Mr. Francillon. Chapter 23. The rain started up again, long before Sebastian reached the Strand, the low-hanging clouds robbing the city of colour to leave only grey. Grey wet streets, flat grey light, grey sky. The air was heavy with the dank scent of wet stone and coal smoke, and the pungent odours of the nearby river. Leaving his horses in Tom's care, Sebastian ducked beneath a trim black awning with the name Francillon neatly lettered in gold. He pushed open the door, the shop bell jangling. An older man behind the counter paused in the act of hanging a botanical illustration of an exotic lily and turned. He looked to be somewhere in his late 60s, his dark hair silvered at the temples, although his movements were full of energy, his small, wiry form still trim and upright. He had the high forehead, tight lips, and thin Gallic nose of his ancestors, French Huguenots, who had fled their homeland after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes more than 100 years before. The Francillons had plied their trade in London for generations, yet his voice still carried a faint inflection when he asked, "May I help you?" Sebastian went to rest his hands on the counter and lean into them. "My name is Devlin. I'm looking into the circumstances surrounding Daniel Eisler's death, and I'm interested in the large blue diamond he was selling. I understand you saw it?" Something flickered in the depths of the Huguenot's pale brown eyes, only to be quickly hidden when he lowered his lashes. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. You're quite certain of that?" "Yes." Sebastian let his gaze travel deliberately around the small shop. A variety of gems, some cut, polished, and set, others, still in the rough, crowded the cases. But the walls above were filled with paintings of birds and insects, and shadow boxes displaying everything from exotic beetles to enormous, brilliantly coloured butterflies. Francillon might have been trained as a lapidary, but his interests obviously included all aspects of natural history. Sebastian said, "I would imagine the prosperity of an establishment such as this relies quite heavily on its reputation for honesty and integrity. Unfortunately, a good name, once lost, can be nearly impossible to reclaim. Francillon has been a respected name for over 100, so I am told. Which is why, I should think, it would be in your best interests not to have the name of your establishment linked to a notorious incident of theft and murder." The tactic was heavy-handed and crude, but effective. Francillon stared back at him, his jaw set hard, his voice tight with suppressed indignation. "Precisely what do you wish to know about the stone? First of all, I'm curious as to why Eisler brought it to you." "I was asked to prepare an illustrated sales prospectus." "And did you?" "I did." "What exactly does that involve?" "Generally, tracing around the stone, weighing it, and preparing a coloured rendering. In this case, both a plan and an elevation." "So you can describe it to me?" "I could. However, I'm not entirely convinced that I should." Once more, Sebastian let his gaze drift significantly around the shop. Francillon cleared his throat. "The specimen in question was a brilliant cut diamond of an extraordinary shade of sapphire blue, unset at the time of my inspection, and weighing in at over 45 carats. It was the first real confirmation Sebastian had received that such a diamond actually existed. He said, "To whom was Eisler planning to sell it?" "I do not know. I was not made privy to that information." "Did he mention where it came from?" "He did not." "But you have some ideas, don't you?" said Sebastian, watching the lapidary's face. Francillon swallowed but remained silent. Sebastian said, "I'm told large blue diamonds are quite rare. So rare, in fact, that an experienced lapidary such as yourself would surely be aware of all such gems in existence. I am unaware of any 45-carat blue diamond in any known collections." "What about a collection that has been lost?" "I beg your pardon?" The French blue was a large sapphire-hued diamond, was it not? It disappeared along with the rest of the French crown jewels exactly 20 years ago this month. That doesn't strike you as rather coincidental? The French blue was larger, over 67 carats, and of a different cut. Diamonds can be recut, can't they? It seems to me that anyone trying to sell the French blue might well find it expedient to alter it. Francelin's gaze met Sebastian's before skittering away. I don't understand why you are here asking me these questions. I am here because Daniel Eisler is dead, and I'm beginning to believe it more and more likely that the French blue had something to do with his murder. But the authorities have already captured the man responsible. They have committed a man to Newgate, yes. I don't believe he's guilty, and I have a fundamental objection to seeing innocent men hang. Francillon hesitated a moment, then reached below the counter to come up with a large folio which he laid open atop the case. He flipped through the volume for a moment, as if looking for something, then swung the book around to face Sebastian. There. He pointed to a full-page coloured illustration. You see? Here is Louis XV's insignia of the Golden Fleece. Sebastian found himself staring at a gaudy confection of gold and priceless gems. At the centre of the piece coiled a magnificent red dragon exquisitely carved from a long, oxblood-hued stone. Scores of what looked like small clear diamonds formed the dragon's wings and tail. Above him rested an enormous clear hexagonal diamond, with a slightly smaller yellow stone above that. But the emblem's true focus was the enormous deep sapphire-blue diamond that nested in the tongues of flame shooting from the dragon's mouth. From below that, nearly dwarfed by the big blue stone, dangled a golden ram, its fleece formed by dozens of small yellow stones set in gold. "What's the big clear diamond at the top here?" asked Sebastian, pointing to it. That was called the Bazeux. At nearly 33 carats it was second in size only to the French blue. The large yellow stones you see here, he pointed to them, and here, are yellow sapphires, 10 carats each. The 5 brilliant-cut diamonds were 5 carats each, and there were literally dozens of smaller stones. These here, in the fleece, were all yellow diamonds. And none of these gems has ever been recovered. Only the carved red dragon, known as the Côte de Bretagne. It was found almost by accident not long after the theft. So we know the piece was broken up? Yes. Francillon closed the book and tucked it out of sight beneath the counter. But you must understand that all of this is nothing more than sheer speculation on my part. Eisler said nothing, to lead me to suspect the diamond he showed me was the French blue recut. Who was the sales prospectus intended for? I told you Eisler never said, but... But? Prompted Sebastian. It is not hard to guess. You mean Prinny, don't you? Francillon shrugged and rolled his eyes, but said nothing. Sebastian studied the small Frenchman's tightly held face. When you first heard Eisler had been murdered, who did you think killed him? Francillon let out a startled huff of laughter. You can't be serious. Oh, but I am. Francillon cleared his throat again and looked pointedly away. Well then, if you must know, I naturally assumed Perlman might have had something to do with it. Who? Samuel Perlman, Eisler's nephew. Isn't he the nephew who found Russell Yates standing over Eisler's body? There is only the one nephew, which is why he is Eisler's sole heir. I didn't know that. Francillon nodded. He is Eisler's sister's son. Eisler never made any secret of the fact he despised the lad. He was always threatening to disinherit him and leave his money to charity. Exactly what did Perlman do to incur his uncle's displeasure? Mr. Eisler always considered his nephew profligate. Is he? Francillon scratched the tip of his nose.
Let us say simply that Mr. Pearlman's attitudes toward money and expenditures were considerably different from Mr. Eisler's own. But there was more to the disaffection than that. Mr. Eisler was also beyond incensed by the lad's recent marriage. He actually told me on Saturday that it was the last straw with him, the last straw. His wife is unsuitable. Eisler considered her so.
A faint smile tightened the skin beside the lapidary's eyes.
Her father is the Archbishop of Durham.
Ah, said Sebastian.
Tell me, was Mr. Pearlman in any way involved in his uncle's diamond business?
Francillon shook his head.
I'd be surprised if Mr. Pearlman ever expressed any desire to become involved. But even if he had, Eisler would never have agreed. Because he considered his nephew incompetent? Or dishonest? Because Mr. Eisler never trusted anyone, even his own kin. In my experience, we all view the world through the prism of our own behavior. If a man is honest, he generally assumes that those he meets will deal honestly with him. As a result, he trusts people and takes them at their word, even when he should not. Since he does not lie or cheat himself, it does not occur to him that others might lie or deceive him. And Eisler? Let's just say that Daniel Eisler went through life in terror of being deceived. Did anyone ever succeed in deceiving him?
The smile lines beside the lapidary's eyes deepened.
Even the wiliest of men are sometimes deceived. But if you're asking me for names, I can't give you any. Eisler kept his secrets well.
Sebastian inclined his head and turned toward the door.
Thank you for your help.
Francillon bowed and went back to tidying the wall behind his cases. Sebastian walked out of the shop and stood beneath the awning, looking out at the rain. A housemaid hurried past, a shawl drawn up over her head, her pattens clicking on the pavement. At the corner, an urchin with a broom was working hard at clearing a pile of wet manure from the street. Sebastian turned and went back into the shop.
Can you think of anyone Eisler was afraid of?
Francillon looked around again, his face pinched with thought. Then he shook his head.
Only dead men.
It struck Sebastian as a peculiar statement. But no matter how he pressed Francillon, the lapidary refused to be drawn any further. Chapter 24. Paul Gibson sat with his hands wrapped around a frothy tankard of ale and his head tipped back against the old-fashioned settle of his favourite pub on Tower Hill. His eyes were sunken and dark with exhaustion, his cheeks covered by a day's growth of beard. Seated across from him, Sebastian took a sip of his own ale and said, "You look like hell." The surgeon gave a hoarse chuckle. "Sure then, but I must be getting old. Time was I could spend all night fighting to save some poor lad's life and then turn out to play a fine game of cricket early the next morning. Now I deliver a contrary babe in the wee hours and find I've a hard time crawling out of bed before evensong." "And how did your contrary babe fare?" "Mother and child are doing just grand, thank you." Gibson's eyes focused on Sebastian's face. "You don't exactly look too chipper there yourself, you know." Sebastian grunted. "The more I find out about Daniel Eisler, the more of a tangled mess events surrounding his murder appear to be." He told Gibson of his previous night's visit to the ancient house in Fountain Lane, of the young man who died in his arms, and of his interesting conversation with the lapidary, Francillon. "Have you spoken to this nephew, Pearlman?" asked Gibson. Sebastian shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to drive out to see Annie again first." "I take it you finished Wilkinson's autopsy?" "I have. Anything?" Gibson shook his head. "I've listed the likely cause of death as Walcheren fever." Sebastian hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until he let it ease out in a long, forceful exhalation. Annie will be glad to hear that. Think she'll believe it? Sebastian met his friend's troubled gaze. Are you saying it isn't true? It could be. I did say likely. The truth is, I simply don't know for certain. He took another deep draught of ale. It must have been a living hell for a man like Wilkinson to find himself reduced to a weak invalid. Yet he told me recently he thought he was getting better. Gibson met Sebastian's gaze and held it. He lied. Leaving Tower Hill, Sebastian drove down to Kensington, where he found Annie Wilkinson seated on a bench in the small walled garden of the square near her lodgings, her gaze resting thoughtfully on Emma, who was sailing a small red boat in a puddle left by the rain. The day was misty and cool, but both mother and child were wrapped up warmly, and Sebastian thought he could understand the need that had driven them here, away from the memories that surely haunted their small rooms down the street. "Devlin," said Annie, rising quickly to her feet when she saw him. "Have you heard anything?" "I've just spoken to Gibson. He says he'll be reporting to the coroner that Reese died of Walcheren fever." She pressed the fingers of one hand to her lips. Thank God. They turned to walk together along the path, with Emma skipping happily ahead of them, her little wooden boat clutched in one fist. He said, "Annie, you told me Reese went for a walk that night at around 8 or 9. Do you know why?" "He did sometimes, right before bed." She looked over at him, her soft grey eyes narrowed. "Why?" Had he seemed unusually troubled by anything that day? She drew up short, her head jerking back, her features tightening. "If he had, do you think I would tell anyone?" "Annie," he said gently, "I'm on your side. I just want to make certain we're not missing anything." She brushed a soft tendril of hair off her forehead with a shaky hand. "I'm sorry." She hesitated a moment, as if considering his question, then said, "Reese hadn't been himself for some time now. It can't be easy watching your health crumble, finding yourself unable to do even the simplest things. But he seemed no different Sunday than he had the day or the week before." "Had he any enemies that you know of?" "Reese? Good heavens, no. You knew him. He could sometimes be quick to judge, but he was never the kind of man who collects enemies." "What are you suggesting? Surely you don't think someone that someone might have murdered him?" "I don't think so, no. But I wanted to be certain." They paused again as Emma squatted down to launch her boat in a new, larger puddle that ran along the edge of the path. Watching her, Annie said quietly, "She remembers Reese now, but she won't for long. Soon he'll just be someone she hears her mother talking about. Someone no more real to her than the tortoise and hare in that book of fables you gave her. She might remember him, or at least the warm glow of his love for her, even if it's only because she grows up hearing you speak of it. But she'll never actually know him, just as he'll never have the joy of watching her grow up into the woman she will become. When I think of it, it's almost more than I can bear." He wanted to say, "Then don't think about it. Dwelling on it now will only twist the pain of his death that much deeper." But he kept the thought to himself, because he knew the truth was that no newly bereaved woman could help thinking these things. As if echoing his thoughts, she said, "How dreadfully maudlin and female I must sound." "You're one of the strongest women I've ever known, Annie. It's all right to give yourself time to grieve." She shook her head, her throat working as she swallowed hard. "You know what one of the worst parts of all this is? I find myself thinking that in some ways I lost Reese, the Reese I fell in love with, 3 years ago, when he sailed for that damned disease-ridden island. He was never the same afterward. Only then I feel so small and selfish and contemptible that I can't stand myself.
Annie, I understand.
She pulled a face that reminded him so much of the girl she'd once been that he found himself smiling. "Listen to me," she said, "more maudlin pap. And I haven't even thanked you for coming all the way out here again to see me."
"I'll come again tomorrow, if I may. Perhaps next time Emma will let me read her a story."
"I think she'd like that." He was aware of mother and child watching him as he let himself out of the garden and climbed up to his curricle's high seat. But when he looked back, it was to see Annie hunkering down beside her daughter, the hem of her black morning gown trailing unheeded in the puddle, as she gave the small red boat a powerful push that sent it skimming across the water before an ever-expanding wake. Chapter 25. By the time Sebastian finally tracked Samuel Pearlman to Tattersall's subscription rooms, he had learned much about Daniel Eisler's flamboyant nephew. Despite Francilla's use of the term lad, Pearlman was actually 42 years old. A patron of the most exclusive establishments in Bond Street and Savile Row, he lived with his new bride in a lavish mansion on the north side of Hanover Square. The source of his wealth was a vast mercantile empire he had inherited from his own father some 10 years before, and then immediately turned over to competent managers, preferring to devote himself to a life of pleasure and excess. As far as Sebastian could discover, he did not gamble, he kept no mistress, and he was not in debt. Pearlman was looking over the points of a delicate white-stockinged bay mare in Tattersall's yard when Sebastian walked up to him. The rain might have eased off, but the colonnaded open market still glistened with scattered puddles through which men and horseflesh splashed. For one intense moment, Pearlman's gaze met Sebastian's over the back of the mare. Then he rolled his eyes, blew out a weary, bored sigh, and said, "Oh, God, you found me." "Were you hiding from me?" Sebastian asked pleasantly, propping one shoulder against a nearby column and crossing his arms at his chest. Pearlman huffed an incredulous laugh and returned his attention to the mare. "Hiding? What a fatiguing, not to mention decidedly plebeian activity. Hardly." He was tall and gangly, with curly dark hair framing a balding pate and a sadly receding chin, a defect unfortunately accentuated by the excessively high shirt points and extravagantly tied cravat he affected. His coat was made skin-tight and nipped in at the waist, his pantaloons were of the palest yellow, his waistcoat of figured silk. Daniel Eisler's extravagant nephew obviously had pretensions to dandyism. Sebastian smiled. "If you know I've been looking for you, then I assume you also know why. I gather you've taken an interest in my uncle's murder, although, to be frank, I can't imagine why, given that the brute responsible is already locked up fast in Newgate awaiting execution." "You mean awaiting trial?" Pearlman waved one long-fingered, exquisitely gloved hand through the air. "Technicality. The man is clearly guilty. I myself found him standing over my poor uncle's lifeless body." "So I am told. I was wondering, why were you there?" Pearlman froze. "I beg your pardon? Why did you choose to visit your uncle that night?" "Why not? He is, or I suppose one should say he was, my only near relative." "And he disliked you excessively?" Pearlman gave up inspecting the horse and turned toward him. "I don't know if I'd go that far, although I won't deny we weren't close. Still, one must do one's duty to one's elderly relatives, you know. Especially when one has expectations from those elderly relatives." "What a decidedly vulgar consideration." "The truth frequently is rather vulgar, I'm afraid." Sebastian reached out to run his hand down the mare's white-blazed nose. "I'm told your uncle threatened to disinherit you." Pearlman gave a tight-lipped smile.
Only every other day. He swore if I didn't mend what he liked to call my extravagant ways that he'd leave everything he owned to charity. But it was never going to happen. So certain. My uncle didn't believe in charity. He'd burn down his house and everything in it before he'd give 1 penny to the poor and needy.
He drawled the words poor and needy the way another man might say flotsam and jetsam.
He could always have decided to leave his fortune to someone else, someone he liked better. He didn't like anyone better. Yes, my uncle despised me, but then he despised everyone. The difference is, I am his sister's son, and when all was said and done, that mattered to him. Not much, mind you. I doubt he'd have walked across the street to save my life. But he believed in keeping money in the family. So if you're trying to insinuate that I might have had reason to kill my uncle, I'm afraid you're sadly off the mark, in addition to being damned insulting.
I would imagine Russell Yates finds your accusation of murder rather insulting as well. Pearlman's nostrils flared, his fashionably pale face now infused with angry colour. Every affectation of boredom and insouciance had disappeared, leaving him trembling with fury and something else, something that looked very much like fear. I walked into my uncle's house and found Yates standing over the body. How the devil are you imagining I might have been the one who shot him?
It's fairly simple, actually. You shoot him, Yates knocks at the door, you panic, run out the back, and then nip around to come charging in the front and accuse Yates of what you yourself have done. That is the most preposterous thing I've ever heard. I know nothing about guns. I've received no military training. I'm not even a sporting man. You don't need to be an expert shot to hit someone who is standing right in front of you.
The rain had started up again, pounding on the gallery roof and rapidly clearing the yard of men and horses. Pearlman squinted up at the lowering sky.
Enough of this nonsense. I'm not going to stand here and listen to this drivel.
He nodded curtly to the mare's handler and started to turn away. Sebastian stopped him by saying, "Tell me about the blue diamond." Pearlman pivoted slowly toward him again. If his face had been red before, it was now white.
I beg your pardon? The big, brilliant cut blue diamond your uncle was selling. You do know about it, don't you? I would imagine it's worth a tidy sum. My uncle had no blue diamond? Oh, but I'm afraid he did. At least, he had it in his possession while he arranged a sale for its proper owner. You're not telling me it's been lost, are you?
The tip of Pearlman's tongue flicked out to wet his lips.
I'm afraid you've been misinformed. Or perhaps you have simply misunderstood something that was said to you.
Perhaps, Sebastian smiled.
I hope for your sake that's true. Otherwise, things might become awkward, I mean, when the diamond's original owner attempts to reclaim his property from the estate.
Still vaguely smiling, Sebastian walked away, leaving Pearlman standing in the open yard, oblivious to the driving rain that splattered mud on his pale yellow pantaloons and melted the high starched points of his ridiculous collar. Chapter 26. "It's an interesting copy," said Abigail McBean, carefully turning the manuscript's worn-browned pages. They had settled in a crowded room on the first floor overlooking the wet garden. Hero suspected the chamber had probably been designed as a morning room, but Abigail had turned it into a combination morning room library, with most of the walls covered by towering bookcases stuffed with old books and a curious assortment of objects. She had the Key of Solomon open on the table and apologized to Hero for failing to offer her refreshment by saying, "I make it a practice never to have food or drink around while viewing a valuable old manuscript." "I quite understand," said Hero, watching her friend. "Is it valuable?" "From a scholarly standpoint, yes." Monetarily, I'm not the one to judge. Going by the writing style, I'd say this copy probably dates to the middle of the 16th century. Which is a century after the invention of the printing press. So, why is it handwritten? Miss McBean turned the next page and frowned down at an illustration of strange geometric design. The Key of Solomon has been translated into Greek, Latin, Italian, French, and to a lesser extent into English. But to my knowledge, it has never been published. Even grimoires that have been printed are frequently also found as manuscripts. There is a belief that handwritten texts contain inherent magical forces of their own, so they're considered more powerful than the printed versions. So it's, what, basically a magic textbook? Yes. It tells you how to make talismans and amulets, how to cast magical spells, how to invoke angels or demons, that sort of thing. For what purpose? The usual, sex, money, and power. What about revenge? That too. All the typical motives for murder, Hero said softly. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I suppose you're right. Miss McBean's hand stilled on the pages. Where did you get this? It was smuggled into England for a man who was murdered last Sunday. You mean Daniel Eisler? You knew him. Miss McBean carefully closed the manuscript's worn leather cover and set it aside. I did, actually. He was obsessed with the occult, and I don't mean in a scholarly sense, although he did try at first to convince me that that was his motive. You mean he believed in it? I eventually came to realize that he did, yes. He was continually approaching me for assistance in translating some difficult passage or tracking down obscure references. You're saying you helped him? Hero asked, not quite managing to keep the surprise out of her voice. Miss McBean went off into one of her hearty gales of laughter. If you're asking did I assist him in summoning demons and casting spells of ruination and destruction, the answer is no. What I was doing up there, she nodded toward the attic room above, was just my way of wrapping my head around what the writers of these texts were up to. She was silent for a moment, her gaze on the scene outside the window, where her tow-headed niece and nephew, umbrellas in hand, could be seen splashing gleefully through rain puddles under the watchful eye of a nursemaid. The girl looked to be about 8, the boy perhaps 3 or 4 years younger. The boy squealed with delight, the girl shouting something Hero couldn't quite catch. Abigail smiled. Then her smile faded. I suppose that in a sense I did help him at first. Inadvertently. When he told me his interest was scholarly, I naturally believed him. I mean, why wouldn't I? It was only gradually I began to realize he was deadly serious about what he was doing. He actually believed in the power of the old rituals and incantations. He had an extensive collection of grimoires. Hero nodded to the Key of Solomon on the table between them. What can you tell me about this one? Well, it's generally considered one of the most, if not the most important of all the grimoires. It purports to date from the time of Solomon, though in reality it was probably written during the Renaissance. Most of them were. For some reason, I always tend to associate magic with medieval times, not the Renaissance. Miss McBean nodded. Folk magic was widespread during the Middle Ages, but by the Renaissance there was a growing sense that magic had degenerated since the days of the Egyptians and Romans. Then, with the fall of Constantinople and the expulsion of the Jews and Moors from Spain, places like France, Germany, and England saw a huge influx of some of the truly ancient magic texts that had been lost to Europe. As a result, in the 15th century, there was a veritable explosion in the writing of new grimoires. You'll find a lot of Jewish Kabbalistic magic, Arab alchemy, and Greco-Roman Egyptian influence in these works. She ran her fingertips over the edge of the battered old manuscript, then sat staring at it thoughtfully. "What is it?" Hero asked, watching her. "I was just thinking. The newspapers said Daniel Eisler was shot. Is that right?" "Yes." "Why?" "It doesn't sound to me as if his interest in the occult had anything to do with what happened to him. I mean, it's not as if he were found spread-eagled on a pentacle with a hand of glory burning on his chest." "A hand of what?" Abigail McBean's eyes crinkled in quiet amusement. "You don't want to know." The amusement faded. "Do you really think this," she indicated the old grimoire, "has something to do with his death?" "Probably not. But there might be something here we're missing. Something important." Hero was aware of Abigail fixing her with a steady stare. "I gather Lord Devlin has taken an interest in Daniel Eisler's death." Hero nodded. "He doesn't believe that Russell Yates, the man who has been arrested for the crime, is guilty." "Ah." Her friend's gaze shifted again to the children playing in the garden. For a moment, Hero thought she was about to say something, but she didn't. Hero said, "Do you know where I could find an English version of the Key of Solomon?" Miss McBean rose to her feet in a waft of lavender mixed oddly with musk. "I have several. I'd be happy to lend you one." "Thank you, but I couldn't let you do that." "No, please. None of the copies I have are especially valuable. Let me do this." "All right. Thank you." The version she lent Hero was smaller, only about 8 inches tall, but written in a beautiful flowing hand and exquisitely illustrated in rich shades of ultramarine and cinnabar and vermilion. Hero glanced through it, her eyes widening. "You said most spells deal with wealth, sex, power, or revenge. Which would you say interested Eisler the most?" Miss McBean thought about it a moment. He seemed particularly obsessed with invocations to constrain the spirits of the dead. Invocations to... Good Lord. "I'm not so sure the good Lord has aught to do with any of this," said Abigail McBean, her plump, pretty face taking on an oddly pinched look, her frizzy red hair like a flame in the rainy day's gloom. "Read the book. You'll see." Outside Abigail McBean's deceptively normal-looking little house, a faint drizzle was still falling from the grey sky. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet grass and fading roses and the acrid bite of smoke from the endless rows of chimneys. As she walked down the short garden path to where her carriage waited at the curb, Hero's attention was all for the task of keeping the rain off the 2 manuscripts in her arms. She didn't notice the dark-haired man in the slouch hat and too big coat until he reared up before her. "There you are. Been waiting for you, I have," he said, his grin wide and vacuous, like a man who laughs at his own private joke, or long ago took leave of his senses. Hero's gaze flew to her yellow-bodied carriage, the horse's hides gleaming blue-black in the rain. She saw her footman, George, start forward, face going slack with sudden alarm. She knew she was in no real danger, yet she felt her skin crawl, her breath quicken in that way common to all living things when confronted with evidence of madness. "Excuse me," she said, making to go around him. Bony and filthy, his hands snaked out, his fingers digging into the sleeve of her carriage dress. "Don't go yet. Got a message for the captain." Quivering with revulsion, Hero jerked her arm away from the man's grasp with such force that she nearly sent the 2 manuscripts in her hands flying. "What captain?" "Captain Lord Devlin. Tell him I'm owed what I'm owed, and he ought by rights to see that I get it. Maybe he don't remember Judd Foy, but he should. Oh, yes, he should." "My lady," said George, coming up beside her. "Is this person bothering you?" Foy held his splayed hands up and out to his sides. His grin never faltered, and his gaze never wavered from Hero's face. "You tell him." "Hmm?" Then he thrust his hands into the pockets of his coat and sauntered away, elbows swinging, lips puckered into a tuneless whistle quickly lost in the patter of the rain. Chapter 27. Sebastian arrived back at Brook Street to find Hero seated at the library table, calmly cleaning a tiny muff flintlock with a burnished walnut stock and engraved gilt mounts that had been a gift from her father. He said, "Is this general maintenance, or did you shoot someone?" She looked up at him. There was no humour in her face, only a cold purposefulness that reminded him disconcertingly of Lord Jarvis. "Ever hear of a man named Judd Foy?" He thought about it a moment, then shook his head. "I don't believe so. Why do you ask?" "Because he was waiting for me when I came out of Abigail McBean's house today. The same man who was watching this house last night. He said his name is Judd Foy, and he wanted me to give you a message." "Bloody hell! How did he know where you were?" She shook her head. "I've no notion." "But he called you Captain. He said, 'Tell the Captain I'm owed what I'm owed.'" "Owed? What does he think he's owed?" "He didn't specify. Whatever it is, though, he seems to believe it's your responsibility to see that he gets it. You may not remember him, but he obviously thinks you should." Sebastian walked over to where a bottle of Burgundy stood with glasses on a tray. He poured himself a drink, then stood with the glass in one hand, his thoughts far away. Judd Foy. Judd Foy? He tried to put the name together with the wet, dishevelled, skeletally thin man from last night, and knew it again, that vague sense of an elusive memory, gone before it was quite grasped. Hero said, "You told me last night that you thought he looked familiar." "He did, but I still can't place him." Sebastian took a slow sip of his wine. "I thought last night that he must have something to do with my investigation into the murder of Daniel Eisler. Now I'm not so sure." "Because he knows you were in the army?" Sebastian nodded. "Although I suppose it's possible he's linked in some way to Matt Tyson. When he said, 'I saw you coming out of his house,' I assumed he was talking about Eisler's house. But he could have meant Hope's house." She listened to him, her face impassive, while he told her of his conversations with Francillon and Pearlman. Then she said, "Is it possible Foy could have something to do with your friend Rhys Wilkinson? You visited his lodging several times in the last few days, haven't you?" "I suppose that's possible, too, although I doubt it." He set aside his glass and reached for his hat and gloves. "Where are you going?" "To ask Sir Henry to look into this Foy. And then I think it's time Lieutenant Tyson and I had a little talk." "Judd Foy?" Sir Henry Lovejoy frowned, his lips pursing thoughtfully as he shook his head. "The name's not familiar to me, but I can ask one of the lads to look into him." "Do you want him arrested?" "He hasn't exactly done anything," said Sebastian. They were walking down Bow Street. The rain had eased up again, but the narrow lane was dark and wet and crowded with a crush of ragged costermongers and squeaky carts overflowing with produce from the nearby market of Covent Garden. The scent of damp earth and sweaty, unwashed bodies hung thick in the air. Sir Henry said, "I had a visit yesterday evening from Mr. Bertram Lee Jones." Sebastian looked over at him. "Oh? Your name came up in conversation. He made a number of demands." Sir Henry pulled at his earlobe, the faintest hint of a smile playing about his normally serious features. "Unfortunately, I can't seem to recall what any of them were."
He's a very prickly magistrate, Mr. Lee Jones. Most West End magistrates are. With good reason. Oh? Why's that?
They turned down the short stretch of Russell Street that led to the open market square. The press had become a nearly intolerable squeeze, and Sebastian noticed that Lovejoy was careful to keep his hand in his pocket, guarding his purse. The magistrate sniffed. Let's just say that a parliamentary inquiry into the licensing of pubs in a number of parishes might uncover a pattern of irregularity. Interesting. After he left, I decided to send one of my lads over to Fountain Lane to make a few inquiries. Given the quick apprehension of Mr. Yates, I suspected Lambeth Street might have neglected to interview some of the locals not directly involved. Sebastian huffed a soft laugh. Lee Jones should have known better than to demand that Bow Street stay out of his district's affairs. And? The constable couldn't find anyone who would admit to being in the area at the time of the murder. Sir Henry cast Sebastian a quick sideways glance. You've heard that 2 men were found dead at Isler's house early this morning. One stabbed in the house, the other shot down in the rear alley? I'd heard, yes. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Sebastian kept his gaze on the crowded market square before them, its rickety stalls piled high with turnips and potatoes, cabbages and squash. Have they been identified? Sir Henry nodded. They have, yes. The ruffian in the house was Morgan Aldrich, a man well known to the authorities in the area, while the body in the alley belonged to his young brother Piers. How did they manage to enter the house? I understand they worked the bars loose at a window in the basement light well, then used a diamond-tipped blade to cut the glass. Unusually sophisticated for common ruffians. It is, yes. Curiously, however, the bolt on the back door also appears to have been tampered with. It was very subtle, so subtle I suspect most people would have missed it entirely. Only Isler's old retainer, Campbell, noticed it. He would, said Sebastian. One suspects, continued Sir Henry, looking at Sebastian intently, that some unknown personage, desirous of concealing his illicit entry, gained admittance through the back door, and that unknown personage is the one responsible for the deaths of the Aldrich brothers, who came in through the basement with no regard for whatever evidence of their housebreaking they were leaving behind. An interesting theory. Only how likely is it that 2 different sets of ruffians would break into the same house at the same time and take to murdering one another? I suppose that would depend on what they were looking for. You wouldn't happen to have any ideas, would you? Sebastian kept his features carefully schooled. Mr. Isler was known to possess a number of valuable items. So he was. Lovejoy paused, his attention momentarily caught by a Punch and Judy professor set up beneath the nearest arcade, then walked on. I almost forgot. My constable did uncover one interesting piece of information. One of the individuals with whom he spoke, a chandler's apprentice, recalled seeing Mr. Yates standing on the pavement before the victim's house the morning of the murder. Isler himself was in his open doorway, and the 2 men were engaged in what the apprentice described as a right royal row. Sebastian felt his jaw tighten with a spurt of quiet rage. Yates had assured him quite emphatically that he'd had no quarrel with Isler. The apprentice knew Yates by name? No, but his description of the man involved was unmistakable. There can't be many sun-darkened gentlemen in London who wear their hair long and affect a gold pirate's hoop in one ear. And the apprentice was certain the argument he witnessed occurred Sunday morning. He was, yes. Seems he encountered the altercation on his way home from services at Holy Trinity.
Did he happen to hear the subject of their quarrel? He did not. He did, however, catch the final heated exchange of words. Seemed Eisler told Yates, "Don't even think about crossing me. I can destroy you, and you know it."
Sebastian squinted up at the temple-like facade of the church overlooking the square.
And did he manage to catch Yates's reply?
I'm afraid he did.
He says Yates laughed out loud and said, "I can split your gullet from stem to stern quicker than a Haymarket whore can pick your pocket, and don't you forget that, you bloody little bastard."
The magistrate paused to look out over the churchyard's jumble of grey, moss-covered tombstones.
Of course, Eisler was shot, not stabbed. But still, it doesn't look good for Mr. Yates.
No, said Sebastian, drawing up beside him.
No, it doesn't.
Chapter 28. Russell Yates had drawn his cell's slack-backed chair up to a small table and was busy writing when the turnkey opened the iron-banded oak door for Sebastian. In the last 24 hours, the ex-privateer had managed to shave and change into clean clothes. A feather bed and warm blankets softened his cot. A pitcher of water and a basin stood on a plain shelf beside a bottle of good cognac and a crystal glass. Prison could be surprisingly comfortable for those wealthy enough to make the appropriate arrangements. But it was still prison.
"I ought to let you hang," said Sebastian without preamble as the turnkey locked the heavy door behind him. "I swear to God, if it weren't for Cat, I would." Yates pushed awkwardly to his feet, his leg irons throwing him off balance. "What the bloody hell does that mean?" "It means that if you can't be honest with me, then you're just wasting my time and yours. And the way I see it, you don't have much time left to waste."
A muscle ticked along the ridge of the man's jawbone.
"What do you think I'm lying to you about?"
Sebastian gave a humorless laugh.
"Have you told me so many bouncers that you can't be certain which ones I've caught on to? I'm talking about last Sunday morning when you stood in the middle of Fountain Lane and threatened to gut Eisler from stem to stern. The chandler who witnessed the exchange will doubtless be testifying at your trial. What do you think the chances of your acquittal are now?"
Yates simply stared at him, his face pale.
Sebastian said, "You claimed you had no quarrel with Eisler. What the hell was it about?"
Yates sank into his chair again, one splayed hand pressing against his cheek with such force that it distorted his features.
"What was the quarrel about?"
Sebastian demanded again, when the other man remained silent.
Yates shifted his hand so that it covered his lower face and mouth. "The old bugger was trying to cheat me. He'd somehow managed to acquire certain information. I don't suppose I need to go into detail as to its nature. He thought he could use it to his advantage." "Why the devil didn't you tell me this before?"
A faint flush darkened the other man's face.
"I suppose I thought if you knew I had a reason to kill him, you wouldn't help me. But I didn't shoot him. I won't deny that I considered it. But I didn't actually do it."
Sebastian studied the other man's pinched features.
The ponderous British legal system called men such as Yates sodomites and punished them with a rare viciousness. But they tended to call themselves mollies. They had created a shadowy culture of their own in London, a hidden but vibrant subworld of pubs and coffee-houses called molly houses, where they felt free to mingle and meet, to dance and cut up a lark. Yet the threat of disgrace, imprisonment, and death hung over them always. The men who moved through that world lived in constant fear of both detection and extortion.
Sebastian said,
"Where did Eisler acquire this information?" "The bastard traded in other people's secrets the same way he traded in gems and fine furniture and art objects. He was always getting nasty bits of information out of people who owed him money." "You mean he was a blackmailer?" "Not in the strictest sense. He was more subtle than that.
But he certainly used what he knew about people to his own advantage.
Exchanging shouted threats in the street doesn't exactly sound subtle to me.
Yates gave a ghost of a smile.
True. But then, I was refusing to play his game. You weren't afraid?
The privateer's jaw hardened.
Men have tried extortion with me before.
Sebastian had heard about the schemes often run against the Mollies. Two confederates would cruise the parks and byways known to be frequented by London's Mollies. Then they'd separate, with one of the pair, usually young and attractive, approaching a likely target to make a bargain. Once the target was in a compromising position, the second confederate would rush in on the couple and threaten to denounce the extortion victim to the authorities unless he paid them, handsomely and repeatedly.
And what did you do to those who thought you a likely victim for extortion? Asked Sebastian. Kill them?
Yates simply stared back at him.
Bloody hell, swore Sebastian. Would you have me believe you wouldn't do the same, in my position?
The two men's gazes met, clashed. Yates said,
If I'd killed Isla, I would tell you. I didn't kill him.
Sebastian went to stare out the small barred window overlooking the press yard below. They called it the press yard because until recently it was where those who refused to enter a plea against charges were literally pressed. Increasing loads of weights were placed upon the accused's chest until he, or she, agreed to plead. Or they were crushed to death, at which point the legal niceties were no longer relevant. He said,
I'm told Daniel Isla was in the process of trying to sell a large blue diamond. A very large blue diamond. Do you know anything about that? No. What about a man named Judd Foy? Ever hear of him?
Foy? Yates shook his head.
I don't think so. What does he look like? Thin, dishevelled. Like he belongs in Bedlam.
A smile flickered across the ex-privateer's features.
Really, Devlin, I'll admit I associate with some rougher sorts, but I do draw the line somewhere. What about a former army lieutenant named Tyson?
You mean Matt Tyson?
So you do know him? I've met him a few times, here and there. Why? Know if he had any dealings with Isla?
Yates thought about it a moment, then said,
He must have. I remember running into him once in Fountain Lane, although it was some time ago now, perhaps as much as a month or so ago. Do you know why he was there?
No.
Why? What does Tyson have to do with this?
Sebastian pushed away from the window.
I don't know, but I intend to find out.
Lieutenant Matt Tyson was about to enter Gentleman Jackson's boxing salon when Sebastian walked up to him and said,
We need to talk. Come, walk with me.
Tyson paused, the faintest hint of a smile tightening the sun-darkened flesh beside his thin lips as he shook his head.
Sorry, I'm meeting someone here at 4.
Sebastian kept his voice pleasant.
We can have our conversation inside if you prefer. I've no doubt Jackson's other patrons would find the sordid details of your court-martial fascinating.
Something flashed in the lieutenant's eyes, something almost immediately hidden by his carefully lowered lids.
I was acquitted, remember? Not by me.
Without glancing at him again, Tyson resettled his hat on his head and turned his steps toward Piccadilly. A thick bank of dark clouds still hung low over the sodden city. Water dripped from overhanging eaves and misted window panes. The pavement glistened dark and wet.
When did you sell out? Asked Sebastian, falling into step beside him. A couple of months ago, if you must know. What the devil difference does it make to you? Curious timing. What is that supposed to mean? only that after all these years it looks as if Wellington is finally turning the tide against the French. I should think it will be a time of great opportunity for a man of your talents."
Tyson's eyes narrowed, but all he said was,
"Sometimes a man just gets tired of killing." "Not all men."
Tyson threw him a quick sideways glance.
"You did."
It had been 2 years now since Sebastian had sold out for a complicated crescendo of reasons he'd yet to come to grips with. But then he had never been the kind of man who took pleasure in killing. Tyson had. Sebastian said,
"What was your business with Daniel Eisler?"
The man's faint smile broadened.
My, you have been busy, haven't you?"
"What was it?" Sebastian said again.
Tyson shrugged. "Eisler bought jewels. I had some to sell. And no, I didn't slit some senorita's throat or rape a convent full of nuns to get them. I took them off a dead French colonel at Badajoz. Where he got them is really none of my affair now, is it?"
The bodies of the French dead were routinely stripped of their valuables, uniforms and boots before being buried or burned. The spoils of war had long been considered a natural supplement to the king's shilling. Officers didn't usually join in the looting of the dead, although some did. But the systematic looting of civilians was something else again. Wellington had always discouraged the age-old tradition of subjecting a conquered city to 3 days of ritual pillage by marauding drunken soldiers, both because it was bad for discipline and because the British liked to portray themselves as saviours rather than conquerors. But Badajoz would remain forever a stain on the honour of the modern British army, for the fortified Spanish frontier city had endured days of savage rape, murder, and pillage after being stormed by Wellington's troops last March. Tyson might claim his booty came from the body of a French colonel, but Sebastian suspected otherwise. He said, "And did Eisler give you a fair price for your items?"
"He did, yes. Otherwise, why should I have done business with him?"
"Who suggested him to you?"
"Thomas Hope."
Tyson shook his head.
"A friend from Spain, and I haven't been anywhere near the old goat in weeks, so if you're looking for someone beside Yates to pin this murder on, you're just going to have to keep on looking."
In Sebastian's experience, most people had a tendency to fidget when they lied. They hesitated, or their voices rose in pitch, or their demeanour shifted in some subtle way. But there were those who could meet your gaze, smile, and lie with a careless grace born of a complete absence of either guilt or fear of detection. Matt Tyson was one of those men.
"I might actually believe you," said Sebastian, "if I hadn't sat on your court-martial board."
A quick flare of anger tightened the lieutenant's features before being carefully smoothed away. He turned his head to watch an elegant red barouche dashing up the street. After a moment he said, "I did see something at Eisler's house the last time I was there, which you might find relevant."
"Oh? What's that?"
"A woman was leaving Fountain Lane just as I arrived. A young, nicely dressed gentlewoman. I couldn't tell you who she was heavily veiled, and got into a hack that was waiting for her. I assumed at first she was there for much the same reason I was, to sell Eisler a piece of her jewellery, probably to pay off a gaming debt. Then I saw Eisler, and the old goat had his flap buttoned awry. He must have taken her right there in the parlour because I could still smell the stink of his lust in the air. I've since heard it's where he always took his women, whores and ladies alike."
"You're saying he made a practice of it?"
"Didn't you know?" Smug amusement bordering on derision suffused the other man's face. "He was quite the nasty old sot, your Eisler. He'd loan money to pretty young things, and then when they couldn't pay his ruinous interest rates, he'd offer them a choice.
Either let him tumble them on that ratty old couch or have whatever trinket they'd pledged declared forfeit. He offered the same deal to men who were late on their payments, if they had a pretty wife.
When Sebastian remained silent, Tyson laughed out loud.
"Don't believe me? Ask that sybaritic nephew of his."
"You mean Pullman? What would he know of it?"
"Far more than you might think. I've heard that one of the ways Pullman kept in his uncle's good graces was by providing him with whores."
Tyson paused as the church bells of the city began to chime the hour, one after the other ringing out over the wet streets.
"And now you really must excuse me. I did mention I was meeting someone at 4.
Sebastian let him go.
Under ordinary circumstances, he'd have been inclined to doubt just about anything a man like Tyson said.
But he kept remembering that dank, foul room with its heavy, old-fashioned chimney-piece, and a small pair of cheap blue satin slippers peeking out from beneath a worn horsehair sofa. Chapter 29. The discovery that Isla had been engaging in a nasty combination of blackmail and sexual exploitation had the potential to open up a vast array of new suspects, most of them, unfortunately, both nameless and faceless. If Yates and Tyson were telling the truth, and Sebastian suspected that in this at least they were, then London must be so full of men and women who'd nursed a secret but powerful reason to murder the old bastard that it was difficult to know where to start. Sebastian was seated in the drawing-room, the blue satin slipper held thoughtfully in his hands when Hero came in, yanking off her wet bonnet and gloves. "I've been looking for the black cat," she said. "I can't find him anywhere."
"Calling what? Here, cat, cat, cat? You need to give him a name."
"He's not my cat. He's yours." She went to stand at the window, her gaze on the rain-washed pavement below. "One of the housemaids saw a man hanging around who sounds like Foy. She said he was trying to coax the cat to come to him with what looked like sardines." Sebastian knew a moment of disquiet, but all he said was,
"The cat's probably just taken shelter from the rain someplace. He'll be back. Where else is he likely to get roast chicken and a bowl of cream?"
She gave him a tight, strained smile and nodded to the slipper in his hand. "What's this?" Sebastian held it up.
"It's one of a pair that I found tucked beneath a tattered old horsehair sofa in Daniel Isler's parlour."
She lifted the shoe from his hand. "This is not a lady's slipper."
"No, it is not."
She looked up at him. "You say both shoes were still there?"
"Yes."
"How odd. I wonder if he gave their owner a new pair and she simply left the old ones."
"Isla? I suspect that old bastard never gave anyone anything, excepting perhaps an inclination for suicide."
"Then I'd say the shoe's owner must have left the premises precipitously." She handed the shoe back to him, somewhat like Cinderella.
"Only I doubt this Cinderella was worried about her coach turning into a pumpkin at the stroke of midnight."
Hero said, "Apart from the fact that walking in one's stocking feet would be decidedly uncomfortable, these shoes, however cheap I might consider them, would nevertheless represent a significant investment for their owner. I doubt she left them behind willingly."
"I'm thinking she might have been there when Isla was shot."
Hero frowned down at the tiny, worn shoe. "And ran away in fear?"
"That's one possibility."
"Are you saying you think your blue satin Cinderella might have shot him?"
"Perhaps."
"So who is she?"
"I have no idea. But I know someone who might." "Oh, God, not you again!"
exclaimed Samuel Pullman when Sebastian came upon him in the showrooms of Christie's in Pall Mall. Sebastian ran his gaze over the framed sepia-coloured drawing of a woman's head that Pullman was examining.
"I'd have thought you just inherited enough of this sort of thing from your uncle to satisfy the acquisitive urgings of even the most ardent collector. I like to keep an eye on what's available,"
said Pullman, leaning forward to squint at the drawing's signature.
Do you think it's really a Leonardo? You tell me. Isler's nephew had changed into tight buff-coloured trousers, a claret and white striped waistcoat, and a monstrously wide cravat meticulously arranged in a complicated style known as the waterfall. He straightened. After our previous conversation, I'd hoped I'd seen the last of you. Sebastian showed his teeth in a smile. Let that be a lesson to you. If you don't care to see me again, you might consider being a bit more forthcoming in your answers to my questions. Perlman breathed a resigned sigh. What now? I've been hearing some interesting tales about your uncle and women. Women? Perlman gave a high-pitched titter. Don't be ridiculous. My uncle was an old man. Not that old. Perlman moved on to a massive, heavily framed oil that took up a considerable section of one wall, his attention all for the darkly swirling scene before him. Sebastian said, I'm told you used to provide your uncle with whores. Perlman cast him a quick sideways glance. And precisely who, one wonders, told you that? Does it matter? When Perlman remained silent, Sebastian said, I think your uncle may have had a woman at his house the night he was shot. Did you send her to him? I did not, but you're not denying that you did sometimes act as his procurer. Perlman kept his gaze on the vast oil. What an ugly little word. You have one you prefer. I won't deny I did occasionally perform certain commissions for him. Define occasionally. Every few weeks or so. Where did the women come from? The Haymarket, Covent Garden, Whirly Devlin. You know as well as I do where to find women of that sort. Are you saying you supplied him with common women you picked up off the street? Perlman swiped the tip of his nose between one pinched thumb and forefinger and sniffed. That's the kind he liked. I've heard he also liked another kind of women. Pretty young gentlewomen who owed him money, or whose husbands owed him money. I wouldn't know anything about that, said Perlman loftily. You wouldn't. I would not. He cast a quick glance around, but the auction rooms were nearly deserted in the gloom of the rainy afternoon. Listen, I'm not denying my uncle had an appetite for women. He did. It was unseemly. But to my knowledge he satisfied those needs with whores. Now, if you'll excuse me, you are distracting me. This is not a leisure activity, you know. Art collecting is serious business. In a moment. So you would have me believe you never heard of him coercing a gentlewoman to share his couch? I have not, no. Sebastian smiled. Unlike Tyson, Samuel Perlman was a terrible liar. Then tell me this. Who owed your uncle money? Perlman gave a tusking huff of derision. That sort of information is privileged. I couldn't tell you even if I knew. Are you saying you don't know? As a matter of fact, I don't. The bastard must have written it all down somewhere, but I'll be damned if I can find his ledgers. He obviously hid them. That's one possibility, said Sebastian. Are you suggesting there's another? Whoever shot Isler could have taken them. Perlman gave another of his derisive little laughs. My uncle was shot by Russell Yates, and everyone in London knows it. Except you, apparently. Sebastian shifted his gaze to the large canvas beside them, a biblical scene complete with plumed Roman soldiers, fainting women, and an angry, bearded man with a bare, heavily muscled chest, who may or may not have been Samson. Looks like a Van Dyke. Perlman opened his eyes in astonishment. Impressive. But that doesn't mean it is. Sebastian turned toward the door. He'd taken 2 steps when Perlman stopped him by saying, I do know the name of one man who owed my uncle money. Beresford. Blair Beresford. Sebastian paused. I thought you said you'd consider that sort of information privileged.
A gleam of what looked suspiciously like sly triumph flared in the other man's eyes.
I know I can rely upon you to exercise the utmost discretion with the information I have provided you. Have something against Beresford, do you?
But Pearlman only smiled faintly and returned to his study of the oil. It took Sebastian a while, but he finally tracked Blair Beresford to Bond Street, where the Irishman waited outside the bow-fronted establishment of one of London's most fashionable milliners. The rain had finally eased up, the clouds breaking apart to show pale aquamarine streaks of clear sky above. Beresford was leaning against the side of Louisa Hope's elegant barouche, his arms folded at his chest, his chin sunk in his cravat, his thoughts evidently far, far away.
"Ah, there you are," said Sebastian, walking up to him.
Beresford straightened with a jerk, his eyes going wide in a way that told Sebastian the young Irishman had obviously at some time in the past several hours had an interesting conversation with his friend Matt Tyson.
"Actually, I was just about to go to see if Louisa—"
"Not to worry," said Sebastian, ruthlessly turning the younger man's steps toward Oxford Street.
"I won't take but a moment of your time. I'm just wondering if you could explain something for me."
Beresford cast an apprehensive glance over his shoulder toward the milliner's shop.
"I can try." "Good. You see, I've been wondering. Why would someone whose cousin is married to one of the richest men in England need to go to a bloodsucker like Daniel Eisler to borrow money?"
Sebastian watched as all the colour drained from the younger man's face to leave him pale and visibly shaken.
"I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." He drew up abruptly. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I really must—" "Cut line," said Sebastian, swinging to face him. "You can answer the question, or I can ask it of Louisa Hope. Which do you prefer?"
Beresford met his gaze, then looked away, his lower jaw thrust out as he exhaled a long, painful breath.
"Louisa doesn't know anything about any of this," he said quietly.
"Why Eisler? Why not go to Hope?" Beresford continued walking, his soft blue eyes fixed on the wet pavement before them.
"I did. The first time." "Go on."
"It all happened one night, right after I first came to London. I fell in with some friends from Oxford. They wanted to try a gaming hell near Portland Place, so I went with them. The stakes were high. Almost before I knew it, I'd lost £1,000. He gave a nearly hysterical laugh. £1,000! My father only clears £1,200 in a good year.
So you went to Hope?
Beresford nodded. He behaved remarkably well under the circumstances. Read me a lecture, of course, but nothing I didn't deserve. When he handed me the money, he warned me there would be no second time.
Don't tell me you went back to the same hell again.
Beresford's lips crimped into a painfully thin line. Hope told me I didn't need to repay him, but it didn't sit right with me to just take his money. The problem was, I knew the only way I could ever get my hands on that much blunt would be to win it.
How much did you lose the second time?
£500. I was winning at first.
You always do.
But then my luck turned. Quite suddenly and rather disastrously. I did have the sense to quit. Only not soon enough.
If you'd had any sense, you wouldn't have gone back there at all.
Beresford's eyes flashed with resentment. You think I don't know that now? I came damn close to putting a pistol in my mouth. There was no way I could go to Hope and admit I'd lost another £500.
So you went to Eisler instead. How the devil did you imagine you would ever repay him? Were you planning to take to the High Toby next?
The rat-a-tat-tat of a drum sounded from the top of the street, accompanied by the tramp of marching feet. Beresford glanced toward the sound, a deep stain of shame spreading across his fair cheeks. That is to say, I agreed to perform certain services for him. Sebastian was beginning to understand at least part of Pullman's motivation in sending him to Beresford.
You mean you undertook to regularly provide him with whores?
Beresford's eyes widened, his throat working painfully as he swallowed.
How did you know? Call it a good guess. Did you provide Isla with a whore last Sunday?
Sunday? No, but I know he had at least one other person doing the same thing I was. Sebastian studied the younger man's handsome, strained face. He struck Sebastian as earnest and basically decent, if dangerously inexperienced and naive. For the most part, he was probably telling the truth. But only for the most part. Sebastian said,
"Where were you that evening? You mean when Isla was shot? I was with Matt Tyson at his rooms in St. James's. We were drinking wine, playing a friendly game of whist, that sort of thing."
Not for the first time, Sebastian found himself wondering at the friendship between the older, battle-hardened lieutenant and this young, fresh-faced Irish boy barely down from Oxford.
"How long have you known Tyson?"
6 weeks or so, I suppose. We met at a musical evening given by a mutual acquaintance. His gaze darted back to where his cousin had appeared in the doorway of the milliner's shop. Her head turned as she conversed with someone behind her. "There's Louisa. I really must—"
"One more question,"
said Sebastian, as a column of soldiers swung into view, red uniforms clean and new, brass buttons glinting in a gleam of sunshine.
"What can you tell me about the blue diamond Isla was selling for the Hopes?"
The younger man's features slackened in a convincing expression of puzzlement.
"Blue diamond?"
He shook his head.
"I'm sorry, I don't know anything about it. Henry Philip Hope is the one who collects gems, and I've only met him a few times. It's possible Thomas Hope purchased this diamond 5 or 6 years ago, perhaps for your cousin."
Beresford looked thoughtful.
"I know he gave Louisa some ridiculously expensive pieces when he was courting her. I remember my mother referring to them rather sardonically as bribes, but I couldn't say exactly what they were. I never saw them, and Louisa actually prefers to wear smaller, more delicate jewellery."
Louisa Hope's voice floated across to them. "Blair?" Beresford gave a quick, flustered bow.
"Excuse me. Please."
Sebastian let him go. He stood and watched the young man lope back down the street, dodging 2 turbaned matrons making their slow, ponderous way arm in arm up the flagway, and nearly colliding with a liveried footman burdened with a pile of packages. He was aware of the column of soldiers drawing abreast of him, side drum tapping, boots tramping out their familiar cadence. They looked to be new recruits, probably on their way to the port, where a ship would carry them away to as yet unfought battles in distant lands. He turned to watch them, his gaze studying the rows of freshly scrubbed faces. Most appeared pathetically eager and excited. A few were anxious. But 1 or 2 bore the distant, focused stare of a man who has seen his own death, and yet marches inexorably toward it. Chapter 30. In Sebastian's experience, men like Blair Beresford rarely committed murder. There was something sad and gentle, almost fragile, about the young man that argued against the kind of passion and violence that murder usually entailed. But he'd learned long ago that most people, however calm and tender, however controlled and even-tempered, were capable of murder if pushed hard enough or put in the wrong situation. He couldn't see Beresford killing Isla over a debt of £500, although he had only Beresford's word for it that the debt actually was £500 and not 10 times that. Would Beresford kill for £5,000? 10,000? Sebastian still didn't think so. But if Isla had goaded or taunted the young man, if he had threatened to expose Beresford's debt and the way in which he was repaying, was Blair Beresford capable of killing a nasty, evil old man while in the grip of a rage born of fear and shame? Sebastian couldn't be certain, but he thought it possible. Turning toward his own curricle, Sebastian found himself wondering once again why Samuel Pearlman had given him Blair Beresford's name. And it occurred to him now that the object of Pearlman's animosity might not be Beresford himself so much as Thomas Hope. If whoever killed Daniel Isla also stole the valuable blue diamond Isla was handling, then as Isla's heir, Pearlman would be responsible for compensating the diamond's owner for its loss, assuming, of course, that the owner could prove Isla had had the gem in his possession. Sebastian suspected a man as astute as Hope would have kept detailed records of any such transaction. But if the blue diamond was indeed the motive for Isla's murder, that would require the killer to have known that the old man had the gem in his possession. So, how many people would have been privy to that information? Francillon, obviously, and Hope, if the diamond was truly his. Samuel Pearlman, perhaps. Blair Beresford? Possibly. Matt Tyson? Again, possibly, if Beresford knew. Only, how had Jacques Collot come to hear of it, and who else might have known? Sebastian started to head back toward Brook Street. Then he changed his mind and turned his horses toward the Strand and the discreet establishment of the lapidary John Francillon. The shutters were already up on the windows of Francillon's small shop on the Strand when Sebastian pushed open the door, the jingle of the brass bell filling the air. Francillon was behind the counter, his back turned, his head bent as he slid a tray into a tall wooden cabinet. "Sorry, we're closed," he said, without even bothering to look up. "You can come back in the morning if you like. We open at 10. Sebastian said, "I have a few more questions I need to ask you." Francillon spun around, the shop's single oil lamp throwing his lithe shadow across the counter and up over the rows of paintings and specimens on the far wall. "But I've already told you everything." "This isn't about Isla's diamond exactly." Sebastian placed his forearms on the polished countertop and leaned into them. "I want you to tell me about the theft of the French crown jewels." Francillon turned to carefully close the cabinet door behind him. "What makes you think I know more than what I've already told you?" "Because jewels are your business, and this was probably the greatest jewel theft in history. Because your people came from France, so I would imagine you've watched the events unfolding there very carefully. And because I don't think you're the kind of man who's comfortable with the idea of letting someone who's innocent hang for a murder he didn't commit." Francillon smoothed his hands over his hair as if to reassure himself of its neatness, although there was not a strand out of place. Then he came to rest one hip on a high stool, his laced fingers resting against his thigh, his gaze far, far away. "Very well. Let me see. You know that the revolutionary government confiscated the crown jewels from Louis XVI after he attempted to flee the country with his family in the summer of 1791? Yes. To give you an idea of the amount of treasure involved, an inventory was made at the time. It ran to something like 50 pages. That much? Francillon nodded. The Bourbons had what was probably the largest collection of jewels in Europe. Altogether, they were valued at more than 24 million livres. The French blue alone was estimated to be worth 3 million livres. So what did the revolutionary government do with them? The crown jewels were declared the property of the people, and placed under guard
in the Hôtel du Garde-Meuble on the Place Louis XV, what later became the Place de la Révolution. He paused, a spasm crossing his face. The Place de la Révolution had become famous as the site of the guillotine. "Go on," said Sebastian. "The jewels were then put on display. The thinking was that since they belonged to the people ought to be allowed to see them. So every Monday the hotel was opened to the public. The jewels remained on display for over a year until August of 1792, when a decision was made to close the exhibit due to the growing instability in Paris." "But they were still kept in the Garde-Meuble." "Oh, yes, in locked cabinets, in a chamber located just above the ground-floor entrance. The chief conservator responsible for the treasures complained constantly that he needed more guards, but—" Francillon shrugged. "It was September of 1792. The entire nation was falling apart." "So at the time of the theft," said Sebastian, "the exhibition was closed?" "It was. But before the visits were suspended, a man named Paul Miette had gone to the Garde-Meuble every Monday for weeks, studying the habits of the guards, the various approaches to the treasure room. There is some evidence he also managed to acquire inside information about the habits of the guards, but that was never proven." "So what happened?" Francillon pulled at his earlobe. "On the night of 11th of September, Miette and some half a dozen of his cohorts simply propped a ladder against the wall at the front of the building, cut a hole in an upstairs window, and climbed inside. There was so much to steal that they couldn't carry it all away with them. But when they realized the theft had not been noticed, they came back 2 nights later, and again 2 nights after that. By their 4th visit, they'd become so bold that they turned the theft into a drunken revelry, complete with whores, food, and wine. Everything from jeweled swords to statues to bells was simply tossed out of the windows to friends waiting in the street below." "You can't be serious," said Sebastian. Francillon sighed. "I wish I were not." They were finally spotted by an officer of the National Guard who sounded the alarm. But it took him so long to convince the building's watchman to open the chamber's doors, which were, of course, still sealed, that the thieves managed to escape. "You're saying none of them were caught?" "1 or 2, who were too drunk or too stupid to run, were taken up at the scene. A few more were arrested later. But none of the actual ringleaders were ever apprehended. In the end, several men were executed. A few were given short prison sentences and then quickly pardoned." "That sounds rather suspicious." "It does it not?" Francillon cleared his throat. "At the time, the public was naturally outraged by the theft of the nation's treasure. Some tried to place the blame for the theft on the Queen, Marie Antoinette, which was ridiculous, given that she was under guard herself at the time. Others thought it was a counter-revolutionary plot to destroy the revolution by stealing France's wealth. But there were those who suspected that forces within the revolutionary government itself had been responsible. You see, the Minister of the Interior had actually suggested back in August that the crown jewels be sold and the proceeds used to support the revolution's paper currency and defray other expenses, in particular the looming war with Austria and Prussia. But there was such an outcry that the scheme was abandoned." "At least publicly," said Sebastian. Francillon met his gaze, his expression solemn. "Exactly." His eyes slid away. "One interesting point is that the thief who is credited with devising the scheme in the first place, Paul Miette, was actually imprisoned in La Force until shortly before the theft, as were nearly a dozen of his colleagues. There have been suggestions that their release was arranged by men within the government." "You say Miette was never captured?" "Never. He simply disappeared. Some of the smaller stones were recovered in Paris in the days and weeks following the theft. But the major pieces, the French blue, the Bazeux, and many, many others have never been seen again. Do you know the names of any of Miette's colleagues?
Francillon frowned with the effort of memory.
Let me see, there was Cadet. He's probably the best known, along with a man named Delange, and of course Collot.
Collot? Said Sebastian sharply. You mean Jacques Collot? Francillon looked at him in surprise.
You have heard of him?
I have.
He claims he comes from a long line of Parisian lapidaries.
Francillon threw back his head and laughed.
I suppose he can certainly claim to come from a long line of ancestors with a marked interest in jewels. But I'm afraid the Collot's talents have never been those of a lapidary.
Meaning?
The Collots are thieves, said Francillon, his lean features hardening. And they have been for 150 years or more.
Sebastian was in his dressing room rubbing ashes into his face when Hero came to stand in the doorway behind him, the black cat perched regally in her arms. He looked over at her and smiled.
So, where was he?
He'd somehow contrived to get himself shut in the tack room in the stables.
Someone needs to tell him about Curiosity and the cat.
With a contemptuous lashing of its long, fluffy tail, the cat jumped from her arms and ran off. "I did," she said. "He didn't appreciate it." She brought her gaze back to his worn breeches and leather waistcoat, the disreputable coat and grimy shirt gleaned from the second-hand clothing stalls in Rosemary Lane. He'd also wrapped padding around his waist that effectively altered both his silhouette and his gait. "Do I take it you're not planning an evening at your club?" He leaned forward, his gaze on the mirror as he dabbed more ashes mixed with grease from the kitchen onto the dark hair at his temples.
"I've just had an interesting conversation with the lapidary Francillon."
"Oh?"
"He tells me there's a strong possibility the theft of the French crown jewels was actually engineered by the revolutionary French government."
Pushing away from the doorframe, she wandered the room, fiddling first with a box of collars, then with one of the ragged coats Calhoun had assembled for Devlin's selection. "What makes you so certain this blue diamond is in any way connected to Isla's death?"
"At this point, I'm not so certain it is. I'm also hearing credible stories about the man's cutthroat lending practices and certain aberrant sexual practices that could very well be what ended up getting him killed."
She glanced over at him. "Define aberrant?"
"Compelling attractive young women to lie with him when they or their husbands fell behind on interest payments."
A wave of revulsion flickered over her face. "I'd say that goes beyond aberrant, all the way to downright evil. The more I hear about Isla, the more I think whoever killed him deserves a reward rather than punishment." Sebastian wiped his hands on a towel.
"I might agree, except for one thing."
"What's that?"
"Whoever murdered Isla is about to let an innocent man hang for what he did."
"True." She hesitated a moment, then said, "So why this continuing interest in the French crown jewels?"
"Because for some reason, the more I look into Isla's affairs, the more the French blue keeps coming up. It obviously fits into all this somewhere. I just can't figure out where or how."
"Which is why you're dressed like a fat publican down on his luck." Sebastian reached for a battered black hat and settled it low on his forehead.
"I've decided I need to have another conversation with my friend Jacques Collot. A candid conversation."
Hero smiled. "And what do you expect him to tell you?"
"Mainly what happened to the French blue between the time it disappeared from the Garde Meuble in Paris and when it reappeared in Daniel Eisler's possession shortly before his death. Propping one foot on the edge of a bench, Sebastian loosened the dagger he kept in a sheath in his boot, then straightened to slip a small double-barreled pistol into the pocket of his tattered greatcoat. And maybe, just maybe, where the bloody diamond is now.
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster. You have reached the end of a part, but not the end of the complete audiobook. So please check your library for the next part of this audiobook.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.
This is Audible.
What Darkness Brings, a Sebastian Saint-Cyr mystery by C.S. Harris.
Chapter 31. By the time Sebastian reached the parish of St. Giles, the darkness of the night was complete. The sickle moon and a few dim stars that had been visible earlier at dusk, hidden now by a haze of coal smoke and scattered clouds. The smell of cook fires and a pervasive dampness left from the day's rain hung heavily in the air, underlain by the inevitable stench of effluvia and decay. As he paid off his hackney driver, a tousle-haired woman in a tawdry, low-cut red gown emerged from the shadows of a nearby doorway to smile archly. "Looking for some fun, Governor?" Sebastian shook his head and turned to push his way through the raucous, drunken crowds of costermongers and day-labourers, thieves and pickpockets, doxies and beggars, his gaze carefully scanning the sea of rough, dirty faces. The East End of London was choked with men like Collot, raised in want and desperation, uneducated, angry, and long ago cut loose from the moral underpinnings that typically anchored those who looked askance at them. Most were English or Irish, but in their midst one also found many French, Danes, Spaniards, even Africans, living precariously from day to day, subsisting largely on potatoes and bread, and crammed as many as 5 or 10 to a room. They wreaked their own kind of vengeance on a system that viewed them as a permanent criminal class, impervious to improvement and suitable only for containment. Those who didn't die young or violently could generally look forward to being either hanged or transported to the nasty new penal colony at Botany Bay that had replaced the earlier hellholes in Georgia and Jamaica. With each step he took, Sebastian allowed himself to sink deeper and deeper into a persona he had affected often during the war when he'd served as an exploring officer in the hills of Iberia. It was Cat who'd first taught him, long ago, that there was more to carrying off an effective disguise than a dirtied face and old clothes. Successful deception lay in recognizing and altering the subtle differences in movement and posture, mannerisms and attitude that distinguish us all. Gone were the upright carriage, the easy confidence and demeanour of the Earl's son. Instead, he moved from one public house and gin shop to the next, with the stooped shoulders, ducked head, and furtive sideways glances of a man who had never known command, who had been forced to claw and bluff his way through life, who could rarely be certain where his next meal would come from, and who always knew that the heavy hand of vengeful authority could fall upon him at any moment. It was in a public house just off Great Earl Street that Sebastian finally spotted his quarry in earnest conversation with 3 cohorts huddled around a battered table. Ordering a pint of ale from a barmaid who couldn't have been more than 14, Sebastian stood with his back to the counter, one knee bent, so that the sole of his boot rested against the rough planking behind him. The close atmosphere smelled of spilled ale and tobacco and unwashed men. Narrowing his eyes against the smoke, he watched Collot nod to his cohorts and rise from the table to walk toward him. Sebastian held himself very still. But the Frenchman brushed past Sebastian without a flicker of either recognition or suspicion and pushed open the door. His companions remained at their table. Setting aside his tankard, Sebastian followed Collot out into the dark coolness of the night. He trailed the Frenchman down a crooked lane, lit only by a rare torch flaring in a rusted sconce, fastened high to the side of a crumbling wall, or by whatever dim light filtered through the thick, grimy panes of old glass in the windows of the occasional coffee-house or gin-shop. Quickening his pace, he caught up with Collot just as the Frenchman was passing a narrow alley between a pawnshop and a tallow candle-maker. As if sensing the danger behind him, Collot half-turned as Sebastian ploughed into him. "Mon Dieu!" he cried, as the force of Sebastian's momentum carried the two men deep into the fetid darkness of the alleyway. Sebastian slammed the Frenchman face-first against a rough brick wall, one hand tightening around Collot's right wrist to yank his arm behind his back and lever it up, effectively holding him pinned in place. "Bête bâtard!" swore Collot, his grey-whiskered face twisted sideways, his hat askew, his one visible eye opened so wide Sebastian could clearly see the white rimming his dark, dilated iris as he struggled against Sebastian's hold. "Put a hand on my purse, you whore's son, and I'll—" "Shut up and listen to me very carefully," hissed Sebastian, every affectation gone from his manner. Collot stilled. "You?" Sebastian drew his lips back into a smile. "Yes, me." "What is this? What do you want?" "Two rules," said Sebastian softly. "Rule number 1. Don't even think about lying to me again. Lies have a tendency to make me cranky, and I'm already not in the best of moods at the moment." "But I did not lie." "Rule number 2, said Sebastian, increasing the pressure on the Frenchman's arm in a way that made him grimace. "Don't waste my time. There's an innocent man in Newgate who's liable to hang for a murder he did not commit. Which means that when you waste my time, you're helping to kill him." "Are you so certain, monsieur, that he is indeed innocent of what he's accused? Perhaps you—" "You're forgetting rule number 2, said Sebastian evenly. Collot fell silent. Sebastian said, "I learned something interesting today. It seems that far from coming from a family of Parisian lapidaries, you are actually descended from a long line of Parisian thieves." Collot huffed a nervous laugh. "Jewel thieves, jewelers. Is there such a difference?" Sebastian was not amused. "Tell me about the theft of the French crown jewels from the Garde Meuble in Paris." "But I never—" Sebastian tightened his grip. "Now you're forgetting both rule number 1 and rule number 2. You told me you sold jewels to Daniel Eisler in Amsterdam in 1792. What I want to know is, was one of them the French blue?" Collot gave a snort of derision. "You think they would allow us to keep something as valuable as the emblem of the Golden Fleece?" "Who is they?" "Danton." Collot spit the word out as if it were a bite of tainted old mutton. The name caught Sebastian by surprise. A coarse, physically ugly mountain of a man, Georges Danton had initially fled the Revolution, only to return and rise to prominence as one of the architects of the Revolutionary Tribunal and the Reign of Terror. Danton? Not the Minister of the Interior, Roland? They were both in on it, the two of them, Danton and Roland, working together. Sebastian said it was Danton who eventually sent Roland to the guillotine. Eventually, yes. But in September of 1792, Danton and Roland were allies. Danton and Robespierre were also allies at one time, remember? Only that didn't save Danton's head when Robespierre eventually decided to move against him now, did it? Sebastian shifted his grip to swing Collot around to face him. In the flickering light thrown by a distant torch, the Frenchman looked pale and slack-jawed, his wayward eye more noticeable than ever. "Why should I believe you?" Collot turned his head and spat. "Why should I care whether you believe me or not? I am telling you,
Danton and Roland wanted to sell the crown jewels because the government needed the money. Only the other members of the government would not agree, so Danton arranged to have the jewels stolen instead. And the French blue, what happened to it? A distant burst of laughter jerked Collot's attention, for a moment, to the lane at the end of the alley. Then he brought his gaze back to Sebastian and smiled. "You don't know anything, do you? That was September of 1792, when the combined armies of Austria and Prussia were camped at Valmy, just 100 miles from Paris. Together they outnumbered the French troops facing them nearly 2-1. If they had advanced on the city then, in the middle of September, they could have taken Paris. The revolution would have been over, finished. That's what Danton was afraid of. He knew what his life would be worth if Louis were restored to the throne." "What are you suggesting, that Danton used the French crown jewels to bribe the Prussian and Austrian armies not to attack Paris?" Collot gave a harsh, ringing laugh. "Not the Prussians and the Austrians. Their commander." Sebastian's eyes widened, for Collot's words opened up an entirely new angle on Isla's murder. He took a step back and released Collot so suddenly the Frenchman sagged and almost fell. For the man commanding the Prussian and Austrian armies at Valmy was none other than Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, husband to George III's sister, the English Princess Augusta, and father to Princess Caroline, the estranged wife of George, the Prince Regent. Chapter 32. Finding himself unexpectedly free, Collot took off in a stumbling trot down the alley, his hands splayed out awkwardly at his sides, the tails of his tattered coat flying in the damp breeze. Sebastian let him go. He was remembering a dark carriage looming out of the night, a frightened young man running toward those whom he believed were his allies, the deadly spurt of flame from the end of a darkened rifle barrel. Who would do something like that? The obvious answer was people without conscience or scruples. People who see their own agents as expendable. People with far more at stake than a mere diamond, however big and rare. Still turning Collot's revelations over in his mind, Sebastian emerged from the alley into the raucous turmoil of the street beyond. Someone was scraping on a fiddle, and half a dozen Irishmen were dancing a jig, cheered on by a circle of laughing, ragged women. Beyond them he could see a lithe, pockmarked man wearing a small-brimmed, dented hat, and standing by himself on the far side of the street. He had one shoulder propped against a rough brick wall, his hands thrust in his pockets, his gaze seemingly directed toward a saucy, red-headed bit of muslin who was smiling at him. But when Sebastian turned south toward Covent Garden, the man readjusted his hat and pushed away from the wall to follow him. As he wound his way up the crowded street, Sebastian was aware of the pockmarked man behind him. The man hung well back, always careful to keep some distance between them. But when Sebastian paused to gaze through the misted window of a coffee-house, his shadow paused too. The man had a lean, sharp-boned face with a small nose, a pointed chin, and dark hair. His clothes were those of a day labourer or apprentice, or someone considerably more unsavoury. Whistling softly, Sebastian continued on. The pockmarked man fell into step behind him. As they neared Longacre, the crowds became more scattered, the neighbourhood less depraved. Sebastian quickened his pace, his footsteps and those of his shadow echoing dully in the narrow streets. He turned right onto Longacre, then immediately drew back into the darkened doorway of a button shop. The pock-marked man rounded the corner and continued past Sebastian some 3 or 4 paces before becoming aware that his quarry had suddenly vanished. He abruptly drew up. Sebastian stepped from the doorway into the light of a street lamp and said, "Who are you, and why the hell are you following me?" The man whirled,
Rather than dissembling or startling in any way, he whipped a nasty knife from beneath his coat and lunged forward to slash the blade across Sebastian's stomach with enough force to have disemboweled him if the steel had cut flesh. Instead, the knife ripped through the covering of the bolster Sebastian had used to pad his torso. A cascade of white feathers spilled around them, fluttering in an airy flurry to the wet pavement. Kiskety! For one unguarded moment the man stared at him, confused. "You son of a bitch!" swore Sebastian, his boot lashing out to smash into his assailant's wrist. The impact sent the knife careening into the darkness. Sebastian followed the kick with a jab of his right fist that caught the man high on the cheekbone and spun him half around. A second blow glanced across his ear and knocked the dented hat flying. With an angry roar, the assailant lowered his head and charged, fists flailing. But the feathers were slick underfoot, the soles of his shoes slipping, throwing him off balance. Sebastian landed another punch against his assailant's temple. The man broke and ran. Leaping off the flagway into the street, he nearly collided with a hackney drawn by a skittish chestnut. The horse reared, neighing in alarm, as the man dashed down the narrow lane that led to St. Paul's and Covent Garden Market. Sebastian pelted after him. They erupted out of the lane into the broad market square, its stalls now shuttered in the darkness. During the day, the piazza before St. Paul's was the site of London's largest produce market, but at night it was given over to the city's demi-monde. Painted women in low-cut gowns hissed and whistled as the two men pelted across the square, sliding awkwardly on the mushy cabbage leaves and smashed rotten fruit underfoot. The man was lithe and agile and amazingly fleet-footed. Rather than gaining on him, Sebastian soon found himself having a hard time keeping up. They raced between rows of shuttered stalls, leapt over piles of refuse, and dodged sleepy, ragged little boys who crawled out from beneath the dark counters to holler at them. On the far side of the square, an aged landau, pulled by a mismatched team of bays, dashed past, its grey-bearded coachman clad in worn livery, its sole passenger a turbaned dowager either too financially pressed or too cheap to employ a footman to ride up behind her. With a running jump, Sebastian's assailant leapt up to catch hold of the rear bar, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the platform. "God damn it!" huffed Sebastian, as the landau bowled on up the street, carrying its uninvited hanger-on away with it. The pock-marked man pivoted agilely, one hand still grasping the bar, the other raised to his forehead in a mocking salute. Sebastian sprinted after the landau for another 2 blocks. Then the carriage turned onto the Strand, picking up speed as it rolled away toward the west. He gave it up. Hunched over, he braced his hands against his thighs, his body shuddering as he drew air into his aching lungs. A few last feathers fluttered down around him like the downy flakes of winter's first snow. "So who was he?" asked Hero, pausing in the doorway to Sebastian's dressing room. The house was quiet around them, the room lit only by a brace of candles on the dressing table. He pulled the ruined shirt off over his head and unwound the bindings that held what was left of the padding around his waist. "I don't know. But he was French." He frowned down at the flesh revealed beneath the bindings. The tip of the man's blade had cut through the padding enough to leave a long, angry wheal across his lower abdomen. "You're acquiring an impressive collection of cuts on your torso," said his wife, pushing away from the doorframe. "All you need now is a slice along the right side of your ribs, and the symmetry will be complete." "Huh," he grunted, and tossed the shredded padding at her. She ducked, laughing, then went to uncork a flask of alcohol and liberally soak a folded cloth. Whoever he was, he must have been watching Jacques Collot rather than you. Otherwise he would have known your protuberant belly began life as a feather pillow. "You're probably right. In which case the question then becomes, who is watching Jacques Collot, and why?" She came to press the alcohol-soaked pad to his cut. He sucked in his breath in an audible hiss. "Stings, does it?" she said, her voice pleasant.
If I didn't know better, I'd suspect you of deriving some sort of fiendish delight from this."
She grunted, her head bent as she focused on her task. "Tell me again what Collot said about the theft." He told her. He watched the way the flickering light from the nearby candles danced across her face, watched as she gripped her lower lip between her teeth while she worked. He said, "Why do I get the distinct impression that none of this is exactly news to you?" She set the pad aside and carefully recorked the flask. "How much do you know about Princess Caroline's father, the Duke of Brunswick?"
"Not much, I'm afraid."
"He was a surprisingly accomplished and unusual man, very much a student of the Enlightenment. They used to call his court at Wolfenbüttel the Versailles of the North. It was a centre for poets and artists and men of letters, and filled with an exquisite collection of books, paintings, and fine furnishings."
"Sounds like Daniel Eisler would have loved it,"
said Sebastian. "Napoleon certainly did."
"He ransacked it."
"I think stripped it would be a more accurate term." She perched on the edge of the bench while he poured warm water in the basin. "Napoleon had something of a grudge against the Duke. You see, in addition to being the brother-in-law of the King of England, father-in-law to the Prince of Wales, and a patron of artists and scholars, he was also considered one of Europe's best generals. When the American colonists revolted against us, good old King George actually asked Brunswick to lead Britain's forces. He refused." Sebastian looked over at her.
"Any particular reason?"
"Some say it was because he wanted King George to fail, that he was sympathetic to the Americans' cause."
"Was he?"
"I suspect he was. In 1792, the French revolutionary government, in their turn, approached Brunswick and asked him to take command of their army. He refused them as well, but not without expressing his support for the reforms they were enacting." Sebastian scrubbed at his face and hair, rinsing away the ashes and grease.
"So why did he agree to take command of the combined armies of Austria and Prussia instead?"
"I don't know. Perhaps they gave him no real choice. But his distrust of the Austrians was well known, as was his belief that the Prussian king, also his cousin, by the way, was a fool." Sebastian reached for a towel.
"According to Collot, Brunswick's army was within 100 miles of Paris at the time of the theft of the French crown jewels."
She nodded. "That's right, at Valmy. It's well known that the revolutionary government tried to negotiate with Brunswick to persuade him to withdraw. A meeting was actually held, and, supposedly, the negotiations failed." Sebastian frowned.
"But Brunswick still didn't attack Paris."
"No, he didn't. And every day he held off was one more day the French were able to use to build up their own forces. Did you know that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was with the Prussian army at Valmy?"
"I did not."
His account of those days makes interesting reading. He was convinced some sort of treachery was afoot. He says there was no conceivable reason why an attack on Paris wasn't launched immediately.
"But there was eventually a battle."
"Eventually, although it was more in the nature of a small skirmish, and after that Brunswick simply withdrew. The next day the National Convention abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. And barely 4 months after that, Louis XVI was beheaded."
"You're saying Collot was right? That Brunswick was bribed?"
"According to the rumours. His price was 5 million livres."
"With part of the payment being delivered in the form of the French blue?"
"That's the rumour." He looked over at her.
"And is the rumour true?"
"I've never been told." Which did not, he realized, exactly answer his question. Their gazes met, and he knew it again, that awareness that no matter how close they might become, Jarvis's shadow and Hero's loyalty to her father would always be between them. She said, After everything you've learned about Isla, the blackmail, the financial exploitation, the sexual debauchery, you still think the mystery surrounding this blue diamond is somehow involved in his death?
Somehow, yes.
She nodded, as if coming to a decision, and rose to her feet. Then you might find it useful to speak to a certain colonel in the Black Brunswickers named Otto von Riedesel. He was in Spain with Wellington up until a few months ago when he was wounded. But before that, he served the old Duke of Brunswick. Sebastian swiped the towel at a drop of water running down his cheek, then tossed it aside. A corps of volunteers raised by the current Duke of Brunswick to fight against Napoleon, the Black Brunswickers, were known for their brutality, and for their fierce desire for revenge. Chapter 33. Wednesday, the 23rd of September. At dawn the next morning, Colonel Otto von Riedesel was exercising a magnificent black Hanoverian on the Row in Hyde Park, when Sebastian brought his own Arab mare in beside him. The colonel glanced over at Sebastian, then looked away, his jaw set hard. A big man, with a full, ruddy face, small brown eyes, and a swooping moustache, he wore the uniform of the Black Brunswickers, or the Black Horde, as they were sometimes called. As a symbol of their state of mourning for the occupied Duchy of Brunswick, now under the control of Napoleon, the Corps' entire uniform was black. Black boots, black trousers, black dolman, black shako. The only touches of colour came from the blue of his dolman's collar and the Brunswicker silver death's head on his black shako. The two men trotted along in a strained silence, filled with the creak of saddle leather, the pounding of their horses' hooves on the wet earth, the chorus of birdsong rising from the sparrows waking in the misty elms lining the path. At last, as if goaded beyond endurance, the Brunswicker exclaimed, "What the hell do you want from me?" "I think you know the answer to that." Von Riedesel gave a loud snort. Sebastian said, "When Daniel Isla was murdered, he had in his possession a large blue diamond. I'm told that diamond was previously held by the late Duke Karl Wilhelm of Brunswick." "I am a simple soldier. What makes you think I know of such things?" "The diamond in question is, in all probability, a recut version of a stone that once formed part of the French crown jewels." The colonel reined in hard, the red of his cheeks darkening to an angry hue, his horse chafing at the bit. "If you mean to suggest that the present Duke's father allowed himself to be bribed into—" "I'm not suggesting anything," said Sebastian calmly. "I frankly couldn't care less how the Duke came into possession of the French blue. I want to know what happened to the gem between the time it was acquired by Karl Wilhelm and when it showed up in the possession of Daniel Isla." "I told you I know nothing of this." Von Riedesel set his spurs to his horse's side, and the black Hanoverian leapt forward. Sebastian kept pace with him. "You're quite certain of that, are you?" "Yes." "I suppose you're right. I should have directed my questions to the Prince Regent. As the Duke's son-in-law and executor of his will, Prinny would surely know what happened to the diamond after the Duke's death." Sebastian showed his teeth in a smile. "Sorry to have troubled you, Colonel. Good day." He was turning his horse's head toward the gate when von Riedesel stopped him. "Wait." Sebastian paused, one eyebrow raised in inquiry. "Ride on with me a moment," snapped the Brunswicker. Sebastian fell in beside him again. Von Riedesel said, "What I have to tell you is in the strictest confidence." "Of course." The Brunswicker set his jaw. 6 years ago, when it became obvious that Napoleon was liable to overrun Brunswick, Duke Karl Wilhelm decided to send his jewel collection to his daughter for safekeeping." "You mean to Princess Caroline?" "Yes." Sebastian studied the colonel's tight red face. "He entrusted you to bring it here, did he?"
Von Riedesel nodded. I carried it in my personal luggage. Unfortunately, it wasn't long after I arrived in London that word reached us of the Duke's death in battle. His widowed Duchess, your own English Princess Augusta, fled to London and sought refuge with her daughter.
He hesitated, then said,
This was in 1806. You know of the shameful straits under which the prince forced his wife to live.
I know, said Sebastian. It was in 1806 that the prince first instituted a governmental inquiry against Caroline in an attempt to rid himself of the wife he'd loathed at first sight. He'd accused her of everything from witchcraft to adultery, but in the end the delicate investigation failed in its objective. In retaliation, the prince, spoiled, petulant, and endlessly indulgent of himself and his string of mistresses, cut off virtually all funds to his wife's household, leaving her in near poverty.
In other words, said Sebastian,
staring off toward the river where the early morning mist was beginning to lift as the sun rose higher into a soft blue sky, Caroline began selling her father's gem collection to pay for her and her mother's living expenses. Discreetly, of course.
She must have been very discreet if Prinny never caught wind of it.
Von Riedesel gave a slight bow.
Just so.
It suddenly struck Sebastian as deliciously ironic that the rare blue diamond now reportedly coveted by the Crown Prince had been previously sold behind his back by his own wife.
And the French blue? I never said Duke Karl Wilhelm possessed the French blue. He did, however, have in his collection a large diamond of the darkest sapphire.
Sebastian ducked his head to hide his smile.
Who bought this large blue diamond from Caroline? You don't seriously expect me to tell you that, do you?
No. But you can tell me if I'm wrong. It was Hope, wasn't it? Not Henry Philip Hope, but Thomas. Wordlessly, the Black Brunswicker kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his body rising and falling in tireless synchronicity with his horse's motion. Hero was standing in the entry hall, her head bowed, as she worked at buttoning her gloves, when Sebastian walked in the house.
"Another crossing sweep interview?" he asked, handing his riding crop, hat and gloves to Maury.
She wore a white cambric walking dress with a high-collared spencer of blue silk ruched down the front. "Yes," she said, her attention all for her buttons, which were extensive. "I'm particularly looking forward to this one. It's a little girl." She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. And he found himself wondering again, unpleasantly, just how much and what she knew that she wasn't telling him. She said, "Discovered something interesting, have you?" He cast a significant glance toward the library, and she walked ahead of him into the room, going to stand beside the empty hearth while he quietly closed the door. He said, "How did you know that the late Duke of Brunswick sent his jewel collection to his daughter, the Princess of Wales, for safekeeping?" "You know I can't tell you that." He studied her flawlessly composed face. The problem was that the most obvious explanation, that she had heard it from her father, made no sense. Jarvis had always served the king and the crown prince, yet von Riedesel and Caroline had manoeuvred behind the prince on this. So why had Jarvis kept their secret? She said, "Was von Riedesel able to tell you who bought the French blue?" "He claims the big blue diamond from the Duke's collection did not come from the French crown jewels, but the gem in question was indeed purchased by Thomas Hope." "So Collot told you the truth?" "He did. The problem is, I don't understand how Collot could have come to have that interesting piece of information. I'm also puzzled as to why Hope would be selling the stone now. He told me himself that this is not a good time to be selling gems. So why is he putting one of the most famous diamonds in the world on the market?" There are rumours.
Yes, he prompted when she hesitated.
The wars are putting an increasing strain on both international merchants and the old-style banking companies. The disruption of trade has simply been too extensive and gone on far too long.
Are you saying Hope and Company is in financial trouble?
She nodded. I understand things have reached such a pass that they may soon be forced to sell to the Barings. They are trying to hold off, but I suspect it's only a matter of time.
The sale of a large, rare diamond might conceivably raise enough to keep the company afloat.
It might, if the value of gems weren't so sadly depressed at the moment. Sebastian went to lean one hip against the edge of his desk, his arms crossed at his chest. "What?" asked Hero, watching him.
"Now there's a motive for murder I hadn't considered."
Hero shook her head. "I don't understand."
Eisler was more than just a diamond merchant. He was a wealthy man in his own right. What if he was unable to sell the diamond for the price Hope wanted? Hope might have decided to kill Eisler and steal his own gem so that he could claim the estimated value of the stone from Eisler's estate and still keep the diamond.
She huffed a disbelieving laugh. "Thomas Hope? You can't be serious."
"You'd be surprised at the things men will do when they get desperate."
She shook her head. "No, I don't believe it. He's not that kind of man."
"I must admit it seems an unlikely explanation to me, although for a different reason."
"What's that?" Sebastian pushed away from the desk. In his mind's eye, he again saw a desperate figure running down a muddy alley, heard the crack of a rifle, felt the spill of warm blood over his hands as he raised a dying boy into his arms. The shooter in the carriage. Chapter 34. Thomas Hope was supervising a couple of workmen repairing the skylight in his 50-foot-long picture gallery when Sebastian paid a call on the banker's Duchess Street mansion. "I ask you," exclaimed the little man in disgust, his mouth puckering furiously, "how difficult can it be to construct a skylight that doesn't leak?" Sebastian squinted up at the ornately plastered ceiling, its lavish pale blue and white swagged medallions marred by an ugly brown stain.
"I suppose that depends on how much it rains."
Hope grunted.
"Fortunately, the gallery is wide enough that none of the paintings were damaged, but look at what it's done to the upholstery of the banquettes. And I only just had them recovered in this lovely pale blue fabric."
"Tragic," agreed Sebastian.
"Could I speak with you a moment in private?"
"Of course," said Hope, padding flat-footedly beside Sebastian toward the far end of the gallery.
"I take it you're still looking into the death of Daniel Eisler?"
"I am." Sebastian hesitated. The man was so earnest and eager that it seemed the height of incivility to accuse him even of dissembling, let alone of something as sordid as murder.
"I had an interesting conversation this morning with an individual who contradicted some of the things you told me the other day."
"Oh?"
"In fact, he confirmed the information I was originally given."
Sebastian paused to rub the back of one knuckle against the side of his nose.
"When one person tells me something, I generally try to keep an open mind about its veracity. But when two completely disparate individuals provide the same information, I'm inclined to believe them."
Hope stared back at him, his eyes narrowing, his face hardening. The man might come across as affable and effete, but it would never do to forget that he owned a company that lent money to kings and emperors.
"I don't know what you're talking about."
"Then let me be more blunt. I think the blue diamond Daniel Eisler had in his possession when he was killed was recut from the French blue, and he was selling it for you. I can promise to try to keep the transaction private, but not at the expense of an innocent man's life." Hope walked over to stand before a massive Rubens, his head tipping back as he stared up at the towering canvas.
"I don't think you quite understand what's at stake here," he said quietly. "This isn't about the possibility of a legal challenge from the Bourbons. If the diamond is indeed the French blue, and I'm not saying that it is, then it has been recut. So while there might be speculation, the association could never be proven." "True, but I don't think it's the Bourbons you're worried about, is it?" Hope cast a quick glance over his shoulder at the workman on the scaffold and shook his head. His voice dropped even lower. "Napoleon Bonaparte has spent the last 8 years in a determined effort to reassemble the French crown jewels. He sees the treasure's loss as a blow to France's honour, to the point that its recovery has become an obsession with him. And the most precious of all the French crown jewels was the Diamant Bleu de la Couronne. It's why he was so determined to overrun the Duchy of Brunswick and ransack the palace, because he was convinced he'd find the French blue there. And he was furious when he didn't. So Napoleon knows the revolutionary government bribed the Duke. I doubt the world will ever know the truth of what happened at Valmy in 1792, but there have always been rumours, and one must remember that Napoleon is himself a general. I've heard it said that, in his opinion, a bribe is the only explanation that makes sense out of what happened at Valmy. All I know is that somehow he found out Eisler had a large blue diamond for sale." "You know this for certain?" Hope nodded. "One of his agents approached Eisler last Saturday morning." "Who?" asked Sebastian sharply. "Who was this agent?" Eisler wouldn't say. He was very nervous, for obvious reasons. When it comes to the search for the French crown jewels, Napoleon has proven himself utterly—" Hope hesitated, as if searching for the right word, then settled for ruthless. "Not to mention lethal," said Sebastian. "So why not agree to sell him the stone?" Hope gave a low laugh that rumbled in his chest. "The Emperor has a bad reputation when it comes to paying for his purchases. You've heard that Eisler provided the diamond necklace Napoleon presented to Empress Marie-Louise as a wedding gift?" "Yes." "The final payment was never made. Eisler lost a small fortune on the transaction. Napoleon's attitude is that the honour of supplying his exalted personage should be reward enough." "It's a tendency he unfortunately shares with the Prince Regent," said Sebastian dryly. "True. But anyone selling jewels to Prinny learned long ago to require a payment up front and in cash." "So why not do the same with the Emperor?" "Because Prinny's agents don't generally kill recalcitrant sellers and steal their merchandise. Napoleon's do." "Are you suggesting that is what happened to Eisler?" Hope gave another quick glance around. "It makes sense, don't you think?" "So you're saying the diamond is missing?" Hope's features contorted with a spasm of anxiety. "It is, yes." Sebastian studied the small man's mobile, expressive face. "Who besides you knew Eisler had the blue diamond?" "It's difficult to say with any certainty. People talk. Someone obviously did. Or else how did Napoleon's agent know to approach Eisler?" "And did this French agent know the identity of the stone's true owner?" "No, how could he? Unless Eisler told him." "Are you so certain that he did not?" Hope looked momentarily confused. "Why would Eisler tell him? In an attempt to save his own life, perhaps?" Sebastian watched the banker suck his lower lip between his teeth as the colour drained from his homely face. Taking pity on the man, Sebastian said, "If Napoleon's agent did kill Eisler and recover the diamond, then the French would have no reason now to come after you." "Yes, but what if the French don't have the diamond? What if someone else murdered Eisler and stole the gem? Or what if Eisler was murdered for some other reason entirely, and Samuel Pearlman now has the diamond?" "Does Pearlman know his uncle was handling the diamond for you?" "Of course he does. I immediately laid claim against the estate for its value." He's refusing to pay, is he?
Hope worked his mouth furiously back and forth. He is trying. He frowned down the length of the gallery to where the workmen were resetting a pane of glass. Then he leaned in closer to ask quietly, "Do you think the French have recovered the diamond?"
"Actually, I'd be very surprised if they have."
Hope looked surprised.
"What makes you so certain?" "Because I think they're still looking for it."
Chapter 35. Samuel Pearlman was watching a cricket match at an oval near Sloane Square when Sebastian walked up to him. He glanced sideways at Sebastian and exhaled in exaggerated exasperation.
"You do realize this is getting tiresome, don't you?"
"For both of us," agreed Sebastian, pausing beside him, his gaze on the batsman.
"Let me give you a hint. It's never a good idea to lie when there's a murder involved. It tends to give people the impression you've something to hide. Something like guilt."
Pearlman laughed out loud.
"Surely you aren't still suggesting I have something to do with my uncle's death?"
"You might. I don't know yet.
But as it happens, I was referring to a certain large, rare gem that's gone missing. You remember the one, the big blue diamond you told me you'd never heard of, despite the fact you were already vociferously denying Thomas Hope's claim against the estate for its value. Now, it's always possible that whoever murdered your uncle also took the diamond, or you could simply be pretending that he did."
Pearlman's dark curly hair quivered against his fashionably pale cheeks.
"Don't be insulting. If I'd any desire to acquire that diamond, I would simply have purchased it."
"Ah,
so you admit you did know about it?" "All right, I did, yes. But I certainly did not steal it. To even suggest such a thing is ridiculous. I'm a wealthy man."
Sebastian kept his gaze on the pitch.
The trouble with wealth is that appearances can be deceptive. Trade is always so fickle, is it not, particularly in time of war? I suspect that between the depredations of Napoleon and the Americans, your interests have not been performing well lately." "My holdings and investments are performing just fine, thank you. So if you're looking for some poor sod to pin this murder on, you're going to need to look elsewhere."
Sebastian gave a slow, nasty smile.
"If that's the way you want to play it, I hope you have your affairs in order."
He bowed and started to move away.
Pearlman raised his voice. "Wait, what does that mean? Or what are you going to do?"
Sebastian pivoted to face him again.
"I don't need to do anything. I wouldn't be surprised if the French already suspect that the stone they're looking for might now be in your possession. You see, Napoleon is under the impression Hope's diamond once formed part of the French crown jewels, and, as you know, the Emperor is not averse to killing in order to get the jewels back."
"But I don't have it."
"Somehow, I suspect Napoleon's agents won't be content to simply take your word for it."
Pearlman threw a quick glance around and lowered his voice.
"Someone's been watching me."
"Really?"
Pearlman nodded solemnly. "I've seen them once or twice, but usually it's just a feeling I get. It's unpleasant, not to mention unsettling." "Have you told the authorities?" "So they can laugh at me? Hardly."
Pearlman licked his lips.
"Listen, I'll tell you what I know, but if you try repeating anything I say in a court of law, I'll deny it to your face."
"Go on."
"You're right. Uncle was selling the diamond for Hope. He even showed it to me several days before he was killed."
"Why?"
"What do you mean, why?" "I was under the impression your uncle didn't like you very much. So why did he show it to you?" "You didn't know my uncle, did you?" "Fortunately, no. He was obsessed with beauty and inordinately proud of the items that came into his possession, even if they belonged to someone else. He liked to show them off." "So where is the diamond now?" "I don't know. He had it in a red Moroccan leather presentation case when he showed it to me. I found the empty case on the floor of the parlour the morning after the murder. Presumably Yates took it when he killed my uncle. Except that Yates didn't kill Isla. A condescending smirk spread across the other man's face. The authorities seem to disagree with you. Sebastian ignored the jibe. Have you searched the house for it? Of course I've searched for the damn thing. You think I want to pay what Hope is demanding for it? Did you ever find your uncle's account books? No. I haven't found those either. A tart edge had crept into Perlman's voice. And did it ever occur to you that both the diamond and your uncle's books could very well be hidden in the same place? Yes, it has occurred to me. Don't take me for a fool. I tell you, I've looked everywhere. I've even started sorting through stuff that obviously hasn't been shifted in decades. Do you mind if I have a look around the house myself? Perlman laughed. You can't be serious. Why not? The other man stared thoughtfully into the distance for a moment, then shrugged. Have a go at it if you like. I'll send a message to Campbell telling him to expect you, but don't say I didn't warn you. Warn me about what? Uncle had some peculiar interests. What kind of interests? But Perlman simply shook his head and said, You'll see. I don't get why this nephew fellow has suddenly up and decided to be all cooperative-like, said Tom, as Sebastian turned his horses toward Holborn. Perhaps because he's afraid that whoever killed his uncle might try to kill him too. Sebastian guided his horses around a brewer's wagon drawn up before the pub at the corner. Or it could be because he killed his uncle himself, but now he's afraid he's got Napoleon's agents after him. Fear can be a powerful motivator. Tom opened his eyes wide. You reckon he might be next? It's certainly possible. We seem to be dealing with some decidedly lethal-minded people. Tom lapsed into a thoughtful silence, but broke it only a few minutes later, saying, What are you expecting to find in that old house? You've already been there twice. True, but my previous ventures were both interrupted. What do you think you might have missed? At this point, far too much. Sebastian was raising his hand to rap Isla's tarnished knocker when the door was jerked open and held wide by a beaming Campbell. I've just received Mr. Perlman's message, said the aged retainer with one of his trembling bows. May I say, my lord, how thrilled I am to be allowed to assist you with one of your investigations. Positively thrilled. Ah, excellent, said Sebastian, stepping inside. He was beginning to realize that an overly enthusiastic witness could, in its own way, be as much of a problem as a stubbornly taciturn one. Campbell beamed. Where shall we start? The attics? The basement? The parlour? How about back here? Said Sebastian, crossing the jumbled old hall to the low archway beside the stairs. Reaching out, he turned the handle of the first door on his left. It was still locked. Do you have the key to this room? Unfortunately, no, my lord. Mr. Isla always kept the key to this particular room. Neither Mrs. Campbell nor myself was ever allowed inside it. When Mr. Perlman searched the house, did he have a key? He did, my lord. I believe he discovered one in Mr. Isla's office safe, but I'm afraid he carried it away with him. I see. Sebastian took off his driving gloves and thrust them into a pocket. Very well, thank you. I'll ring if I need you. Campbell's face fell with disappointment, but he bowed with a sigh of resignation and tottered away. Sebastian waited until the old man had shuffled out of sight. Then he removed from his pocket a set of metal shafts on a ring. It was called a picklock, a device with which Sebastian had become adept during his time as an exploring officer.
It required only a keen sense of hearing and a deft touch, both of which Sebastian possessed. Easing the appropriate bent tip into the lock, he carefully slid aside the lock's gates. The door popped open. The room beyond lay in near total darkness. Closing the door behind him, Sebastian crossed to the window to jerk open the thick curtains, then turned. The chamber was empty, except for a trunk and a long table upon which a small number of objects were neatly arranged. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was scrupulously clean, the walls freshly painted, the worn flagstone-paved floor well scrubbed. There was no rug. Instead, a design had been traced onto the floor with what looked like chalk. His muscles oddly tense, Sebastian walked slowly toward it. He was standing on the edge of an enormous circle superimposed on a square, with 3 smaller circles inside it. 4 even smaller circles occupied what he suspected were the compass points, each containing a strange geometric symbol within it. More symbols were strategically placed between the second and third inner circles, along with what looked like a verse written in a strange script. At the very centre of the figure stood an earthenware vessel filled with burnt charcoal. The scent of frankincense and aloe, vervain and musk hung heavy in the air. Sebastian felt a faint, inexplicable chill run up his spine. Turning, he let his gaze rove over the objects laid out on the long, narrow table. 2 knives, one with a white hilt, the other with a black hilt, lay beside a short lance. The tips of all 3 were stained dark with what looked like blood. Beside the blades rested a trumpet flanked by 2 white candles. Frowning, Sebastian went to throw open the lid of the trunk, and found himself staring at a white linen robe with a series of curious geometric symbols embroidered on the breast in red silk thread. Beneath the robe lay a pair of white leather slippers covered with more strange designs, also in red, and a square package wrapped in black silk. Opening it gingerly, he exposed a pile of snowy white, newly made vellum sheets. Each sheet contained a single figure composed of circles, symbols, and geometric forms similar to that on the floor, but differing in subtle ways. Some were drawn in brilliant blues and reds, others in gold and green, or black and silver. He flipped through them, pausing at one in particular that seemed to both repel and attract him at the same time. At its centre lay what looked like a spinning disk within a triangle. Around the triangle were drawn 2 circles, one within the other, between which was written what looked like a verse. He hesitated a moment, then rolled the parchment like a scroll and thrust it inside his coat. Replacing the remainder of the vellums and the white garments, he lowered the lid of the chest and went to close the curtains. He found himself wondering what Samuel Pearlman must have thought when he first unlocked the door to this room. Or had Pearlman already known of his uncle's peculiar interests before he began searching the house on Fountain Lane? Sebastian shut the door behind him, then went in search of the aged butler. With a deliriously excited Campbell once more at his side, he examined the rest of the house, from the attics and dusty, crowded bedrooms down to the kitchen basement. But his search was perfunctory, for he had no real expectation of finding anything. Men like Daniel Eisler did not give up their secrets easily. Chapter 36. The little girl looked to be 8 or 9 years old, although she told Hero she would be 12 the week before Christmas. Hero was beginning to realize that she was hopeless when it came to estimating children's ages. A plain child named Elsie, she had small, unremarkable features, and a habit of frowning thoughtfully before she answered each of Hero's questions. Her nondescript hair was braided inexpertly into 2 plaits that stuck out at odd angles from her head, while her faded navy frock was hopelessly tattered, with large triangular rents that someone had tried to repair with big crooked stitches. but her face was surprisingly clean, and she wore a cotton bonnet tied around her neck with ribbons. She'd pushed the bonnet off her head so that it bounced about her shoulders every time she dropped a curtsy, which was often.
"I've been sweeping 9 months now, me lady," she told Hero with one of her bobbing curtsies. "Me mother died last year, you see. She used to bring in money making lace, and now she's gone, me dad can't make enough to keep us."
She nodded to the 2 small children, a boy of about 3 and a girl of perhaps 5, who sat on the steps behind her, playing with a pile of oyster shells.
"I got to bring the little ones with me when I sweeps, which scares me, 'cause I'm always afraid they're going to run out in front of a carriage when me back is turned."
Hero watched a stylish barouche drawn by a team of high-stepping bays dash up the street, and knew an echo of the little girl's fear. Children were always being run over and killed in the streets of London. She cleared her throat. "What does your father do?" Elsie dropped another of her little curtsies.
"He's a cutler, my lady, but the work's been slow lately. Real slow."
"And was it his idea that you take up sweeping?"
"Oh, no, my lady. I got the idea all by myself. At first I tried singing songs. I could get 4 or 5 pence a day for singing, even more on Saturday nights at the market."
"So why did you give that up?"
"I only knows a few songs, and I guess people got tired of hearing them because after a while I wasn't making much at all. If I could read, I could buy some new ballads and sing 'em, but I ain't never been able to go to school on account of having to watch the children."
"Would you like to go to school?" A wistful look came over the child's small, plain features.
"Oh, yes, me lady, ever so much."
Hero blinked and looked down at her notebook. "And how much do you make sweeping at your crossing?"
"Usually I takes in between 6 and 8 pence, but I can't come in really wet weather on account of the little ones."
Another carriage was rumbling down the street toward them, and Elsie cast a quick, anxious glance at her siblings. "How long do you find your broom lasts?"
"A week, usually. I don't sweep in dry weather. The take is always bad on those days, you know. So when it's dry, I go back to singing."
"That's very clever of you," said Hero, impressed. All the boys to whom she'd spoken had also complained about the poor take in dry weather. But Elsie was the first crossing sweep she'd found who thought to do something else on those days. "What time do you usually come to work?"
"Well, I try to get here before 8 in the morning, so's I can sweep the crossing before the carriages and carts get thick. They scares me. I always try to stand back when I see one coming."
"And how late do you stay?" Elsie frowned thoughtfully.
"This time of year, usually till 4 or 5. Me dad wants me home before it starts getting real dark, so I can't stay out late like the boys."
"Who gives you more money, the ladies or the gentlemen?"
"Oh, the gentleman almost always gives me more than the ladies. But there's an old woman what keeps a beer shop just over there."
She nodded across the narrow street.
"She gives me a hunk of bread and cheese every day for tea, and I shares it with the children."
Hero checked her list of possible questions. "What do you see yourself doing in 10 years' time? Do you think you'll always be a crossing sweeper?"
"I hope not."
Elsie glanced back at the 2 children now following the progress of a bug along the steps.
"Once Mick and Jessup gets big enough to look after themselves, maybe I could get a situation as a servant in a house. I'd work hard, truly I would. Only you can't get a situation without proper clothes, so I don't know how that'll ever come to pass."
She smoothed one anxious hand down over her tattered skirt. Hero smiled. "Did you mend your dress yourself?"
"No, me lady. Me dad did that. He braids me hair every morning, too, before he goes out looking for work."
Simple words, thought Hero, but they transformed the unknown father from some unfeeling monster who sent his little girl out to sweep the streets into an impoverished man doing the best he could to care for his young children without a wife. She pressed a guinea into the girl's small hand. "Here, get yourself and the children something to eat. Then go home for the day." The little girl's nearly lashless eyes grew round with wonder, and she dropped another of her bobbing little curtsies. "Oh, thank you, milady." Hero was watching the children run off hand in hand when a frisson of awareness passed over her. She turned her head to find Devlin walking toward her, the fitful afternoon sun warm on his lean, handsome face, his movements languid and graceful and sensuously beautiful, and it struck her that there was something so deliciously wicked about a woman enjoying the mere sight of her husband in broad daylight that the Society for the Suppression of Vice would probably outlaw it, if they could. "You can't save them all, you know," he said, coming to stand beside her, his gaze on the running children. "There's too many of them." "How did you know what I was thinking?" "I was watching you. It's written all over your face." "Ah, I'm beginning to wonder if it's the baby that's turning me into such a maudlin sentimentalist." "Whatever you do, don't tell Jarvis. He'd be scandalized." Devlin laughed out loud. "Your secret is safe with me." They turned to walk toward her waiting carriage. "Were you looking for me for some reason in particular?" "I was. I've something I'd like to show your Miss Abigail McBean. Care to introduce me to her?" "Of course." "What is it? Another manuscript?" He shook his head. "Something that I suspect is far more sinister." "It's called a magic circle," said Abigail McBean, holding the unrolled vellum with hands that were not quite steady. Sebastian and Hero were seated in Abigail's crowded little morning room, with its towering shelves overflowing with manuscripts and learned texts on magic, alchemy, and witchcraft. "Where did you get this?" Devlin said, "I found it along with a number of others in a chest in Daniel Eisler's house." She looked up at him. "You say there were many?" "Yes." "So what made you choose this particular one to bring to me?" Hero watched in bemusement as a faint hint of colour touched her husband's high cheekbones. "That, I'm afraid, I can't fully explain. At the risk of sounding fanciful, this one seemed more powerful, almost menacing." "That's because it is. In fact, I'd describe it as downright nasty." Rising to her feet, she went to select a volume from her shelves and brought it back to lay it open on the table before them. On the page was an almost identical figure. "This circle is known as the fourth pentacle of Saturn." Devlin looked up at her and shook his head. "What does that mean?" "In magic, there are 7 heavenly bodies, each of which rules its own day and certain designated hours within the day. Operations, which is what magic spells are called by those who practice them, are thought best performed on the hour and day ruled by their relevant planet. The sun is considered the realm of temporal wealth and the favour of princes. Venus governs friendship and love, while Mercury is devoted to eloquence and intelligence. The moon is the planet of voyages and messages. The hours and days of Jupiter are best for obtaining riches and all you can desire, while Mars is for ruin, slaughter, and death." "And Saturn?" She met his gaze squarely. "The hours and days of Saturn are for summoning souls and demons from hell." "Nice," said Devlin. Abigail pointed at the Hebrew words printed around the sides of the triangle. "This is from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, 4th verse, and reads, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord.'" "The Bible?" said Hero in surprise. "Are you telling me this nasty old man was performing magic spells while quoting the Bible?" Abigail nodded. "Most of the grimoires contain biblical verses. The Bible has long been considered a source of powerful magic." She traced the strange writing around the circle. "See this? It's from the Psalms. It reads, "As he clothed himself with cursing like with a garment, so let it come into his bowels like water, like oil into his bones." Devlin frowned.
What alphabet is that?
It's an alphabet of 22 letters called the Transitus Fluvii. It's found in Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 16th century grimoire, third book of occult philosophy, although I don't know if it originated with him. Basically, I guess you could call it an occult alphabet. She sank back into her chair. The items on the table you described would be used for various magic rituals or operations. The short lance is supposed to be dipped in the blood of a magpie, while the knife with the white hilt is dipped in the blood of a gosling and the juice of the pimpernel. "And the knife with the black hilt?" asked Hero. Abigail glanced over at her. A knife with a black hilt is only used to summon evil spirits. It's dipped in the juice of hemlock and the blood of a black cat. "Oh, God," whispered Hero. "That's what the cat was for."
"And it explains why Isla kept all those birds,"
said Devlin, picking up the vellum to study it again. Abigail nodded. They would also have been used for sacrifices. White animals and birds are typically sacrificed to good spirits, and black to evil spirits.
"He did seem to favour the black,"
said Devlin. Abigail laced her hands together in her lap so tightly the knuckles showed white. She looked like a simple red-haired spinster, prim and plain. Until one remembered she was surrounded by texts on magic and the darkest secrets of the occult. "He was not a nice man," she said, her voice oddly strained, tight. "I'm glad he's dead."
"You sound like Hero,"
said Devlin, looking up. "He caused great harm and unhappiness to many. True justice is rare in this world, but this time, at least, I think we have seen it in action."
"Unless an innocent man hangs for his murder."
Abigail's anger seemed to drain away, leaving her looking troubled. "You will be able to prove that this man Yates is innocent, won't you?"
"I don't know."
Devlin carefully rolled the white sheet of vellum.
"You said this is called the fourth pentacle of Saturn. What is it used for?"
"Operations of ruin, destruction, and death." "I wonder whose death he was trying to cause," said Hero. Devlin's gaze met hers.
"If we knew that, we might know who killed him."
Chapter 37. "Ah, Lord Devlin," said Sir Henry Lovejoy when Sebastian stopped by Bow Street to see him later that afternoon. "I was just about to send a message round to Brook Street. I've discovered some interesting information about that fellow you asked me to look into."
"You mean Judd Foy?"
"That's the one, yes."
"You found him?"
"Not yet, no, but I thought you might like to know that it seems he was once a rifleman."
"With what regiment?"
"The 114th Foot. He was invalided out in 1809.
"Good God!
Is he Sergeant Judah Foy?"
"He is."
"Yes." Something of Sebastian's reaction must have shown on his face, because Lovejoy's eyes narrowed.
"You know him?"
"You could say that." Tyson was cupping wafers at Menton's shooting gallery when Sebastian came to stand off to one side and quietly watch. The man's movements were smooth and assured, his aim as flawless as one might expect of someone who'd purchased his first pair of colours at the age of 16. He shot 3 times more before looking over at Sebastian and saying,
"I take it you're not here for the entertainment value?"
Sebastian crossed his arms at his chest and smiled.
"Don't mind me."
Tyson's handsome features remained impassive, but Sebastian saw his eyes darken. He handed his flintlock to the attendant and stripped off the leather guards he wore to protect his cuffs from the powder.
"I've finished."
Sebastian watched him walk over to pour water into a basin and wash his hands. "Tell me about Judd Foy." Tyson paused for a moment, then went back to soaping his hands.
"Who?" You do remember Sergeant Judah Foy, don't you? He was a rifleman with your regiment. Not only that, but he's the sergeant who testified in your defense at your court-martial. If it hadn't been for him, you'd have hanged. I remember him. I must admit, said Sebastian, his appearance has changed so radically that I didn't recognize him. Tyson shook the water from his hands and reached for the towel offered by an attendant. I'm not surprised. He got kicked in the head by one of the supply wagon's mules. He's never been right since then, which is a polite way of saying the man belongs in a madhouse. You wouldn't happen to know where I might find him. Did you try Bedlam? Sebastian shook his head. He's very much a free man, and he seems to be labouring under the opinion that he suffered some sort of injustice. Do you know anything about that? Tyson tossed the towel aside. As I recall, after the accident he had difficulty distinguishing between his own property and that of others. Why? What does any of this have to do with me? I don't know that it does. Tyson reached for his coat and shrugged into it. I told you the man is mad. Is he dangerous? He may well be. Tyson adjusted his cuffs. Do you think him involved in Eisler's murder in some way? Was Foy acquainted with Eisler? Now, how would I know? The man was a sergeant, not exactly one of my intimates. Unlike Beresford? Tyson looked over at him. What's that supposed to mean? Did you know Eisler was in the habit of acquiring information about people and then using it against them? Tyson turned to walk toward the entrance. I can't say I'm surprised. Are you? Sebastian fell into step beside him. It occurs to me that Eisler could have been playing his tricks on Blair Beresford, threatening to tell Hope about his gambling losses. Tyson looked over at him. What makes you think Beresford has gambling debts? He told me himself. Beresford isn't exactly what you'd consider a ripe target for blackmail. He has no money, as Eisler himself obviously knew all too well. To my knowledge, Eisler's form of blackmail was more subtle than your normal variety of extortion. Something flickered across Tyson's face, then was gone. Perhaps, but I can't imagine what Beresford has that might have interested Eisler. He is the younger son of a small Irish landowner in London for a few months. Seems an unusual friend for someone who spent 10 years fighting from India to Spain. Tyson drew up on the flagway before the shooting gallery. The golden September sunlight fell hard across his face, accentuating the harsh lines and deep grooves dug there by a decade of forced marches and indifferent rations, and overexposure to a fierce tropical sun. What are you suggesting? That I ought to be spending my days at the Fox and Hound, knocking back tankards of stout and reminiscing with my fellow officers about the good old days? I'm 26, not 76. Blair Beresford is quick-witted and endlessly amusing. He is also a brilliant poet. He took the Newdigate Prize at Oxford for one of his poems. Did you know? No. There is much that you do not know. Tyson squinted up at the sun. And now you really must excuse me. I have an appointment with my tailor. Sebastian watched the lieutenant turn to saunter toward Bond Street, but stopped him by saying, How did you happen to meet Beresford, anyway? Tyson pivoted slowly to face him again, his dark eyes narrowing with a tight smile that could have meant anything. We met through Yeats. Then he touched his hand to his hat and walked on. Since her marriage to Russell Yeats, Cat Boleyn had lived in a sprawling townhouse on Cavendish Square. It was a fashionable address favoured by the nobility and wealthy merchants and bankers, all of whom no doubt looked upon their notorious new neighbours with scandalised horror. Cat might have been the most acclaimed actress on the London stage, but she was still an actress. And although it was not well known, She'd once survived as a homeless, abused child on the streets of London by selling the only thing of value she possessed: herself. It was a time she rarely spoke of, but Sebastian had seen the way she looked at the young, ragged girls who haunted the back alleys of Covent Garden. He knew only too well the mark those days had left upon her. He'd tried to ease the damage done to her by that desperate time, by the English soldiers who'd raped and killed her mother, by her aunt's lecherous husband, but he knew he'd never really succeeded. He found himself pondering why he was remembering these things now as he mounted the steps to her front door. For Kat was a woman who asked for neither pity nor solace, but who forged her own victories and her own revenge. She was crossing the vast marbled entry hall when her staid butler opened the door to Sebastian. He saw the breath of surprise that shadowed her face at the sight of him, for she had been married a year, and yet this was the first time he had ever come here, to the house she shared with Yates. "Devlin," she said, taking both his hands to draw him into a nearby salon. "What is it? Have you discovered something?" She wore a simple gown of white-figured muslin sashed in primrose, with a delicate strand of pearls threaded through the dark auburn-shot fall of her curls, and he held her fingers just a shade too long before squeezing them and letting her go. "Nothing that makes any sense yet. But I don't like the way Yates's name keeps coming up the more I look into things." She held his gaze squarely, her eyes deep and vividly blue, and so much like those of the man who was her father, and not his, that it still hurt just to look at her. She said, "He didn't do it, Sebastian." "Maybe he didn't, but I'm beginning to suspect he knows far more about what is going on than he would have me believe." He drew her over to sit beside him on a sofa near the window. "Are you familiar with a man named Blair Beresford?" Kat Boleyn might never receive invitations to London's most exclusive balls and parties, but she still socialized with Yates's easy-going male friends and acted as hostess at his dinners. She thought about it a moment, then shook her head. "I don't believe so. Why? Who is he?" "A beautiful, curly-headed, blue-eyed Irish poet, only lately down from Oxford." She gave a soft laugh. "In general, Yates has very little patience with poets, especially those just down from Oxford." "What about an army lieutenant named Matt Tyson? Mid-20s, dark. Also good-looking, although not in Beresford's boyish ways. Has a rather rakish scar on his chin. Him, I do know. Yates finds him amusing." Amusing. It was the same word Tyson had used to describe Beresford. "But you don't like him," said Sebastian. Her smile faded. "He's never been anything except charming and gracious to me, but... Let's just say I wouldn't ever want to turn my back on him. Metaphorically speaking, of course." "Do you know if he—" Sebastian hesitated, struggling for a way to put his question into words. "Has the same inclinations as Yates?" She understood what he meant. "I don't know, but I can ask." She tipped her head to one side, her gaze on his face, and he wondered what she saw there. She was always far too good at knowing what he was thinking. "Why did you come here to me, Devlin? Why not ask Yates directly?" "Because I'm not convinced he is being as honest with me as he could be." She pushed up from the sofa and went to fiddle with the heavy satin drapes at the window overlooking the square. "What?" he asked, watching her. She exhaled a long breath. "To be frank, I'm not certain he's being exactly honest with me, either." "Why? Why would he lie?" She shook her head. "I don't know." But her gaze slid from his in a way he did not like. He said, "Do you know anything about a large blue diamond whose sale Eisler was handling? a diamond that may once have formed part of the French crown jewels.
He watched her carefully and saw no trace of anything in her face other than puzzlement and surprise, followed swiftly by what looked very much like fear.
But then, he reminded himself, it would never do to forget that Kat was an actress. A very good one. And it struck him as ironic and troubling that he found himself doubting both of the women in his life, although for vastly different reasons.
She said,
"What are you suggesting? That the French are somehow involved in Eisler's murder?" "You know about Napoleon's quest to recover the French crown jewels?"
"Yes."
A simple answer that told him she probably knew more than he did. Once she had worked for the French, passing secrets to Napoleon's agents in an effort to weaken England and free Ireland. She claimed she'd severed that relationship long ago, but Sebastian suspected she still had contacts with her old Confederates, as did Yates. He said, "Who would Napoleon task to secure the diamond? Would he send in someone new, or would he use a contact already in place?" "It's difficult to say. He's taken both approaches in the past." "Would it be possible to find out?" He half expected her to tell him no. Instead, she twitched the heavy drape in place and smoothed it down, although it already hung straight. "I can try." He let his gaze drift over the familiar planes of her face, the thickly lashed, slightly tilted eyes, the small, childlike nose, the wide, sensual mouth. His love for her still coursed deep and strong, as he knew it always would. He had loved her since he was so very young, untested by battle, and as yet untouched by the bitterest of disillusionments. Even when he'd believed she'd betrayed him, even when he'd tried to forget her, he had loved her still. Their souls had touched in a way granted to few, and he knew that even if he never saw her again, his life would forever be entwined with hers. But he also knew that with every passing day the distance between them yawned subtly deeper and wider. And it disturbed him to realize the extent to which he neither trusted nor believed her. Chapter 38. After Devlin left, Kat sat down and composed a carefully worded note she dispatched to a certain Irish gentleman of her acquaintance. Then she ordered her carriage and set off for Newgate Prison. She found Yates standing beside his cell's small barred window overlooking the press yard. There was an uncharacteristic tension in the way he held himself, and she went to slide her arms around his waist and press her cheek against his taut back in a quiet gesture of friendship and comfort. They were two outcasts who'd made common cause together against both their enemies and the disapproving world. In many ways, he was like the brother she had never had, and she found she had to squeeze her eyes shut against the sudden upsurge of unexpected emotion at the thought of losing him. "This is a pleasant surprise," he said, closing his hands over hers and tilting back his head until it rested against hers. "I didn't expect to see you again today. Shouldn't you be getting ready for the theatre?" "I've time yet." Beneath her encircling arms, she felt his torso expand with his breath. He said, "Your dashing Viscount came to see me this morning." "Devlin isn't my Viscount any more." "True, but then he's not exactly your brother either, is he?" When she remained silent, he said, "I'm sorry. That was totally uncalled for." "It's all right," she said softly. He nodded toward the window where the ancient masonry that formed the prison's gatehouse was just visible. "Do you know what that chamber is over there, right above the entrance gate? They call it Jack Ketch's kitchen. I'm told that's where they used to preserve the quartered bodies of those executed for treason before putting them on display around the metropolis. They'd boil them in vast cauldrons full of pitch, tar, and oil. Must have smelled ghastly. The heads were treated to a different process, of course. Those were parboiled with bay, salt, and cumin. I suppose I should be thankful that in our own more enlightened era I can look forward to merely dancing the hempen jig for the amusement of the populace, before being given over to the surgeons for the edification of their students.
You're not going to hang?
A faint smile touched his lips. The verdict of the coroner's inquest is in. My trial has been scheduled for Saturday. Did you know?
Oh, God, so soon.
She was aware of a pressing sense of urgency that came close to panic. And she understood then why he had been standing here watching the last of the light fade from his prison's walls. She said,
Is there anything you know about Eisler that you haven't told Devlin?
I don't think so.
He turned to face her.
Do you think I want to hang? She studied his dark, handsome face, the gold pirate's hoop in his ear winking in the fading light. She said,
To be honest, I don't understand why you're still in prison.
Jarvis could have had all charges against you dropped days ago, only he hasn't done it.
He knows you have the power to destroy him. All you need do is release the evidence you have against him. Yet he's not afraid. Why not?
He remained silent, but she read the answer in his face.
It's because of me, isn't it? She whispered.
That's what he told you when he came to see you the night of your arrest. He warned you that the documents you hold can protect you, or they can protect me.
But they can't protect us both.
Yates held himself very still. She said, I'm right, aren't I? He told you that if you made any move against him, he'd have me killed. Yates turned to where a bottle of his best brandy stood beside a glass. Unfortunately, I've only the one glass. May I offer you something to drink? She shook her head. You don't mind if I do? He poured himself a large measure. So you see, he said, setting the bottle aside, I have even more incentive to cooperate with your Viscount than you previously thought. He took a long, slow swallow of his brandy and looked over at her. You came for a reason. What was it?
Devlin wanted me to ask you about Matt Tyson.
Yates frowned. I already told him I know the man only slightly. What more is there?
Where did you meet him?
In a molly house on Pall Mall. Why?
Kat sucked in a quick breath. So, he's a molly?
Of course he is. So is Beresford. The last of the light was leaching rapidly from the sky. Kat knew she should be at the theatre preparing for that evening's performance. Instead, she went for a stroll through the flower stalls of Covent Garden Market. Already the square lay in deep shadow, the few remaining vegetable and fruit sellers scrambling to hawk their fading produce cheap before closing for the night. Only the florists, nurserymen, and bouquet girls were still doing a brisk trade, selling flowers to the theatre, music hall, and restaurant managers, and to earnest beaux looking for posies to present to their lovers. The air was full of laughter and shouting, and a sweet, familiar medley of floral scents that always took her back to another time, another place. When she was a little girl, growing up in a small white house overlooking the misty emerald swath of a Dublin green, Kat's mother and stepfather used to take her to the market that set up every Wednesday afternoon in the cobbled medieval square of their parish church. She could remember running excitedly from one stall to the next, exclaiming over the displays of satin hair ribbons and lace collars and carved wooden tops. But her mother's favourite stalls were always those selling bunches of yellow daffodils and rainbow-hued tulips, or pots of rue and pennyroyal, hollyhock seedlings and briar rose cuttings. She'd take them home and plant them in the narrow strip of garden beside their cottage's front stoop. Even now,
All these years later, if Cat closed her eyes and breathed deeply, she could still see her mother's strong hands sinking into the rich, dark earth, a faint, faraway smile on her lips that told of a deep and rare contentment. In some indefinable way, Cat knew that the child she'd once been had resented the joy and peace her mother found in her garden. But she'd never been able to decide if her selfishness came from the wish that her mother would find that deep, unalloyed joy in her daughter alone, or if she'd simply envied the tranquillity she glimpsed in her mother's face. And it shamed Cat now to remember that she had begrudged her mother those brief interludes of peace and happiness. There had been so little of either in Arabella Nolan's short life. Now, as she breathed in the heady scents from the banks of Michaelmas daisies, ferns, and chrysanthemums, Cat found herself wondering if it was her mother's spirit that had guided her here, to the peace of this place. Or was this love of growing things a trait passed down from mother to daughter, like dark hair and a talent for acting? A tendency that had always been there, nestled hidden within her, only waiting to be discovered. She smiled at the thought. Then the smile faded as she became aware of a sudden charge of tension in the atmosphere, the rush of heavy feet. A trader's high-pitched voice whined, "Hey, what the hell you doing?" Cat's eyes flew open. Rough hands seized her from behind. She lunged against the unseen man's fierce grip, tried to scream. A calloused palm slapped down across her mouth, grinding her lips against her teeth and flattening her nose so that she had to fight to draw air. She smelled dirt and onions and fetid breath as he pressed his beard-roughened cheek against hers and whispered, "Come with me quiet-like and I'll see you don't get hurt." Chapter 39. Cat heaved against the man's hold and felt his arms tighten around her in a fierce hug. He dragged her backward toward the shadowy, narrow lane that ran along the old soot-stained nave of the church. She tried to bite the thick, dirty fingers smothering her, but the pressure was so brutal she could get no purchase. "I say there," bleated one of the florists, stepping from behind his stall. "You can't do that." A second man, a wiry, black-haired brute with a pock-scarred face and small, sharp nose, turned to thrust a blunderbuss pistol into the trader's face. "Mind your own business or lose your head." His English diction was careful and precise, but Cat caught the faint, unmistakable traces of French inflection and knew a new leap of terror. The florist backed off, hands splayed out at his sides, face slack. Her heart was pounding, her mouth achingly dry, the shouts of the scattered costermongers and stall-keepers echoing oddly in her head as if she were at the base of a well. The market square spun around her in a blur of startled, frightened faces, wet paving, spilled chrysanthemums. A flock of pigeons whirled up from the church portico, pale outstretched wings beating the cool, damp air. She tried to twist her body sideways, but her captor's fingers dug into her cruelly, his breath hot against her ear. "You want to live, don't give me trouble. You hear, girl? Because what I do with you afterward is up to me. You got that?" She made herself go utterly limp, as if fainting from fear, her hands dangling slack at her sides. She heard him give a grunt of satisfaction. "Have your friend bring the bloody cart up quick," he told his pock-marked companion. "Let's get out of here." They were passing the last stall in the row, a rough shed given over to the sale of earthen crockery, the stall's seller cowering wide-eyed against the rickety frame as if he could somehow make himself disappear into the weathered post behind him. Cat's captor was half dragging, half carrying her now, a drooping dead weight that sagged in his arms, so that his effort was more focused on keeping her upright than on restraining her. Flinging out one hand, she grasped the lip of a stout pitcher from the edge of the stall's counter and swung it up and back to smash it against the side of her captor's head. He let out a rumbling roar, his grip on her slackening with surprise and pain. She twisted sideways, ignoring the wrenching pain that shot from her wrist as he tried too late to tighten his hold on her. "You bloody son of a bitch!" she screamed. grabbing a platter off the stall and breaking it against his face. "I ought to cut out your bloody liver and feed it to the crows." He howled, blood spurting from his cut face, his arms flinging up to protect his head as she snatched up a bowl and hurled it at him. "Oi! What are you doing to me crockery?" bleated the stall owner. "Your bloody crockery!" shouted Cat, whirling to heave a plate at him. "You worthless, stinking coward! You would have just stood there and watched him kill me." "You fool!" screamed the pock-marked man to his companion, as a shouting, angry crowd of stall-keepers and costermongers, bouquet girls and nurserymen bore down on them. "Don't just stand there, grab her." "'Tain't no way to treat a lady," hollered a big black-haired porter. "You mind your own business," growled the pock-marked man, flourishing his pistol. A rotten tomato flew through the air to break in a red splat against his face. The air filled with the day's unsold produce, spoiling turnips and overripe melons, mouldy pears and putrid apples. For one moment the two men held their ground. Then the plucked, gutted carcass of a chicken whacked against the side of the bigger ruffian's head. He turned and ran, feet slipping and sliding on a sea of rotten vegetables, splattered fruit and smashed crockery. His companion hesitated a moment, then followed, swerving around the church steps to duck down the side street. "Lay a hand on me again and I'll kill you! You hear?" yelled Cat, hurling a last earthenware bowl after them as they pelted down the lane to their waiting cart. She was no longer Cat Boleyn, the toast of London's stage. She was Cat Noland, the scrappy, angry young orphan who'd struggled to survive in the fetid back alleys of a vast, unfriendly city. "I'll cut off your pathetic yards and feed them to the stray dogs in Moorfield. I'll decorate London Bridge with your entrails. But the men were already piling into their waiting cart, its driver whipping up his horses into a mad gallop that took them careening round the corner and out of sight. Cat let her hand fall back to her side, her fingers clenched tight around the lip of the rough mug she still held, her heart thundering in her chest.
"Do you know the story of the mice and the cat?"
asked Emma Wilkinson, looking up at Sebastian with her father's big grey eyes. They were seated before the feeble fire in Annie Wilkinson's tiny Kensington parlour. He'd come here, as promised, to tell Emma a story before she went to bed. He'd expected the experience to be awkward, for he was a man with little exposure to children. But as Emma settled more comfortably against him, and he felt her baby soft curls brush his chin, he was surprised to find his thoughts drifting to the child that would be born to Hero in just a few short months.
"It's my favourite,"
said Emma. "I might not tell it exactly the same as your papa."
"That's all right," said Emma. "Papa always tells it a little differently each time."
Sebastian glanced over to where Annie sat darning a sheet by the fading light of the rainy day, and he knew by the quick rise and fall of her chest that the child's use of the present tense was not lost on her either. "Very well," he said. "Once upon a time, a colony of mice lived a happy, peaceful existence within the walls of a small village shop. The mice were well fed and content, but the man who owned the shop wasn't happy with all those mice stealing his grain and nibbling on his cheese. So he bought himself a cat, who patrolled his shop and quickly terrorized the poor mice to the point they were too afraid even to come out of their little holes in the wainscoting and eat."
"What colour was the cat?"
Emma asked. "A big black cat, with a bushy tail."
"Papa always says a tabby."
"Sorry." Emma giggled. "Anyway," said Sebastian, "the mice quickly realized that if they didn't do something about the cat, they would either starve to death or get eaten themselves. So they all got together to try to come up with a solution. There was much arguing and shouting, but no one could think of anything that would work. Finally, a clever young mouse stood up and said, 'The problem is that the cat is so quiet we can't hear him when he's sneaking up on us. All we need to do is tie a bell around his neck, and in that way we'll always know when he's coming.' Now all the other mice thought this was a splendid idea. Everyone was cheering and clapping the young mouse on the shoulder and telling him how very clever he was,
and calling him a hero. All except for one old mouse so aged his hair had turned as white as the frost. He cleared his throat and stood up to say— Sebastian dropped his voice into a gravelly Glaswegian rasp. "I'll not be denying that tying a bell about the cat's neck would surely warn us of his approach. There's only one wee problem." The old man paused to let his gaze drift around the assembly of anxious mice and said, "Who bells the cat?" shouted Emma, jumping up to clap her hands before collapsing against him again in a fit of giggles. "You've heard this before," said Sebastian in mock solemnity. "Only about 100 times," said Annie, setting aside her darning to come to take the child into her arms. Her gaze met his over the little girl's dark head. "Thank you." "It was my pleasure, truly."
A faint smile touched her lips. "You'll make a wonderful father." Afterward, he wondered whether it had been an idle remark, or if something of his own thoughts and emotions had shown on his face. Later that evening, Sebastian was looking over a history of the French Revolution, while Hero sat reading Abigail Macbean's English translation of The Key of Solomon. The black cat lay curled up on the hearth beside them. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "I conjure you spirits by all the patriarchs, prophets, apostles, evangelists, martyrs, confessors, virgins and widows, and by Jerusalem the holy city of God, and by heaven and earth and all that therein is, and by all other virtues, and by the elements of the world, and by St. Peter, apostle of Rome, and by the crown of thorn that was worn on God's head." She looked up. "I thought this was supposed to have been written by Solomon." "Details, details," said Sebastian, looking up as a distant knock sounded at the front door. "Expecting anyone?" asked Hero. Sebastian shook his head. A moment later, Maury appeared in the doorway.
"The Earl of Hendon to see you, my lord."
Sebastian was aware of Hero's silent gaze upon him. In all the weeks of their marriage, Hendon had never yet paid a call on Brook Street, nor had Sebastian taken his bride to Hendon's sprawling pile in Grosvenor Square. Yet she had never asked him that most obvious question. Why? Maury cleared his throat.
"His lordship says it is a matter of the utmost importance. I've taken the liberty of showing him to the library."
Sebastian was aware of a deep sense of disquiet. After all that had been said between them, he could think of few developments that would motivate Hendon to come here.
None of them were good.
"Excuse me," he said to Hero, and left the room. He found the Earl standing before the library's empty hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, his heavily jowled features sagged with worry. "What is it?" asked Sebastian without preamble. "What has happened?"
"Cat was attacked this evening in Covent Garden Market."
"Is she all right?" It came out sharper than he'd intended. Hendon nodded.
"Yes. Fortunately, the costermongers and stall-keepers rallied and helped her drive the assailants away. She suffered a slight injury to her arm, but that is all."
Wordlessly, Sebastian walked over to pour 2 brandies. He handed one to the Earl. Hendon took it without hesitation.
"She says she doesn't know who the men were, or why they attacked her."
Sebastian took a long, slow swallow of his own brandy and felt it burn all the way down.
"You don't believe her?" "I don't know what to believe. Although, frankly, I'm inclined to suspect it has something to do with this damned business about Yates."
"If so, why wouldn't she tell you?"
"I don't know. I was hoping perhaps you knew the answer to that."
Sebastian shook his head.
"I'm afraid there's far too much going on here that I don't understand yet."
Hendon stared down at his brandy.
"She tells me you have undertaken to prove Yates's innocence."
When Sebastian remained silent, Hendon cleared his throat and said gruffly,
"Thank you. I'm not doing it for you."
There was a long, pained pause. Then Hendon said,
"No, of course not."
He set aside the brandy untasted and reached for his hat.
"Give my regards to your wife."
Then he bowed and left. Sebastian sent at once for his carriage to be brought around. He was waiting with one arm propped against the mantel, his gaze on the cold hearth before him, his thoughts far away, when he felt the black cat brush against his leg, and looked up to find Hero watching him.
"I beg your pardon," he said, straightening. "I didn't hear you come in."
"That's a first." She bent to scoop up the purring cat into her arms. "Has something happened?"
"Cat Boleyn was attacked this evening in Covent Garden. She's unhurt, but it's worrisome."
A frown line appeared between Hero's eyes. "You think it's connected in some way to Isla's murder?"
"Yes."
She said, "Why would Hendon bring you word of Cat Boleyn?" His gaze met hers, and he found himself thinking,
when enemies become friends and then lovers, at what point do the last barriers drop? When are the final secrets revealed?
She had been his wife for 6 weeks. She shared his bed every night and was carrying his child. Yet there was so much they did not know about each other, so many things he'd never told her, so much of which they'd never spoken. And neither had ever uttered those 3 simple but powerful words, "I love you." He said bluntly,
"Cat is Hendon's natural daughter. None of us knew it until last autumn. To say the discovery was distressing would be one of the year's great understatements."
He saw the shock of comprehension in her eyes, along with something else he hadn't expected. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Sebastian, I'm so sorry." He drained his brandy and set the empty glass aside.
"If you're imagining our quaint family circle as some grand tragedy, don't. In the end, that discovery, as sordid and shocking as it was, turned out to be only the first act in what has since come to resemble nothing so much as a tawdry farce."
"You don't look to me as if you're laughing."
"Yes. Well—"
He would have said more, for there was so much else he needed to tell her. Only, at that moment, Murray appeared in the doorway to say,
"Your carriage is ready, my lord."
He hesitated. She reached out to touch his arm lightly. "Go on, Sebastian. I understand." And so he left her there, the black cat held cradled in her arms, like a child. Chapter 40. He found Cat curled up on the sofa before a fire in her drawing-room, her left arm resting in a sling.
"Please, don't get up,"
Sebastian said, as she struggled to do so. She sat up anyway, her small stockinged feet peeking out from beneath the hem of her muslin gown.
"I asked Hendon not to carry this tale to you, but he obviously didn't listen."
Sebastian came to rest his hands on her shoulders and stare down into her upturned face.
"How are you, truly?"
"Gibson says it's nothing serious. A sprain only. One of the men grabbed hold of my arm, and I must have twisted it in my attempt to get away."
"What the bloody hell happened? And why the devil did you go to Hendon rather than to me?"
"Stop glowering, Sebastian. I didn't go to Hendon. He stopped by this evening by chance to see how I was doing, and I made the mistake of giving him an honest answer when he asked how I came to injure myself."
"Did you give him an honest answer?"
She smiled. "For the most part, I have no idea who those 2 men were, but I don't think their intent was to kill me, at least not right away. They were trying to drag me to a cart they had waiting nearby." Sebastian walked away to stand at the window overlooking the darkened square below.
"Did you act on the question I asked you this afternoon?"
"I did, yes. But I only sent a vague message to someone requesting a meeting." I didn't go into detail on why." He glanced over at her.
"They might know why."
She shook her head. "I don't think this individual would harm me."
"So certain."
She smoothed her free hand down over her lap and did not answer him. He said,
"I think Napoleon's men are still looking for that diamond. If they didn't kill Eisler, but believe that Yates did, they might think he has it."
"So why snatch me?"
"To use as a bargaining chip, perhaps?"
"As in, you give us the diamond and we'll give you your wife?" She considered it a moment, then said, "I believe one of the men who tried to grab me may have been French." Sebastian frowned.
"Thin? With a pock-marked face?"
"Yes." "How did you know?"
"I tangled with him in 7 Dials last night."
He paused.
"Did you have a chance to speak to Yates?"
She nodded.
"You were right about Beresford and Tyson. They are Molly's."
She kept her gaze on his face.
"That's significant."
"Why?"
"Eisler liked to collect information on people."
"You mean for blackmail?"
"I don't think he extorted actual cash payments in return for his silence. He used what he knew to influence people, to force them to do what he wanted them to do."
"I'd call that blackmail."
"In a sense, I suppose it is."
She frowned thoughtfully.
"According to Yates, Blair Beresford is the younger son of a small Irish landowner. What could he possibly have that Eisler either wanted or could use?" "I wasn't thinking about Beresford."
"You mean Tyson?" She was silent for a moment, as if considering this. Then she said, "He's also a younger son."
"He is. But he had gems he was selling to Eisler. Eisler may have tried to use the information he had to drive a hard bargain."
"You're suggesting this gives Tyson a motive for murder?"
"I'd say it does, yes. Although if Eisler tried to use threats to pressure Matt Tyson, he was a fool. Tyson is the kind of man who would as soon slit your throat as look at you."
"Where does he say he was last Sunday evening?"
"Beresford claims they'd spent the evening in Tyson's rooms in St. James's Street."
She raked the curls off her forehead with a hand Sebastian noticed was not quite steady. "We're running out of time, Devlin. Yates's trial has been scheduled for Saturday." He wanted to go to her, to take her in his arms and hold her in comfort. It occurred to him that if she were, in truth, his sister, then he could have done so, and no one would have thought twice about it. And that suddenly struck him as the cruelest irony of all. He said,
"The person you sent your message to, who was it?"
"You know I can't tell you that."
"Even to save your own life?"
But she only shook her head, a sad smile playing about her full, beautiful lips. Leaving the house in Cavendish Square, Sebastian walked into a crisp night, scented by a pungent mixture of coal smoke and damp stone, and the hot oil from the street lamps that flickered faintly as if stirred by an unseen hand. He started to leap up into his waiting carriage, then changed his mind and sent his coachman home. Turning toward Regent's Park, he walked down wide paved streets lined with stately brick and stucco houses that stood where just 20 years before he and his brothers had run through meadows golden with ripening hay. In those days there'd been a small pond shaded by chestnuts, just about there, he decided, where that livery stable now stood. He remembered one time when his brother Cecil had found an old Roman coin buried in the mud while they were collecting tadpoles, and Richard, the eldest, and therefore their father's heir, tried to claim it as his own in some twisted interpretation of the rules of primogeniture. Their mother had been there too, the sun warm on her fair hair, her voice gay with laughter as she separated the squabbling boys. And none of it, had really been as he'd thought it to be. At what point, he thought again, At what point do the last barriers drop? When are the final secrets revealed? But when he arrived back at Brook Street, it was to find Hero's bedroom in darkness. He stood for a moment in the doorway and watched the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. Then he turned away. By the time he awoke the next morning, she had already left for more of her interviews. Thursday, 24th of September. At precisely 5 minutes to 11 the next morning, Sebastian walked into the Lambeth Street public office to find Bertram Lee Jones bustling about with flapping robes, his wig askew as he sorted through a stack of files.
"We don't open until 11, snapped the magistrate. "What do you want?"
"I'm wondering if you have a list of the people who owed Daniel Eisler money." Lee Jones grunted, his attention all for his files.
"Now, why would I want something like that?"
"From what I'm hearing, Eisler dabbled in everything from blackmail to magic to sexual exploitation. A man like that accumulates a lot of enemies." The magistrate looked up.
"Maybe, but that doesn't alter the fact that Russell Yates is the one who actually killed him. He'll be standing trial this Saturday."
"Rather hasty, don't you think?"
"As it happens, no, I don't. The man is clearly guilty. Why keep him locked up at His Majesty's expense when he could provide a spot of sport for the populace by dancing at the end of a rope?"
Sebastian studied the man's overfed, self-confident face. "I've heard it said that when King George was still in his right mind, it was his habit to personally examine the cases of each and every prisoner condemned to death in London. They say he could frequently be found weighing the evidence against them in the small hours of the night, and that he would closet himself with his chaplain to pray at the time of their deaths."
"Did he now?"
Lee Jones banged his files together and gathered them under one beefy arm.
"Well, it's no wonder he went mad then now, isn't it? If you ask me, a morning spent watching a half-dozen rascals hang is nearly as good a sport as a fox hunt."
He gave Sebastian a broad wink.
"You could join us afterwards at the keeper's house for a breakfast of deviled kidneys. It's quite the tradition, you know. Now, you'll have to excuse me. I've a hearing to attend."
He put up a hand to straighten his wig.
"Good day to you, my lord."